Good morning. It's 7 o'clock on today's show. After Donald Trump tells Vladimir Putin not to escalate the conflict in Ukraine, blasts are reported in Kiev overnight.
Plus, the Prime Minister heads to Paris for Armistice Day before heading to Baku for a key climate summit.
And as we prepare for those Armistice Day commemorations, both here and on the continent, we'll be joined by Alistair Bruce.
It is Armistice Day, Monday, the 11th of November. Your headlines. Air raid sirens and power cuts across Ukraine overnight, shortly after Donald Trump reportedly urges Vladimir Putin not to escalate the war. Climate finance top of the agenda at COP as developing nations demand support for decarbonising their rapidly growing economies. Sir Keir Starmer heads to Paris for Armistice Day, the first Prime Minister to do so since Sir Winston Churchill. After last week's violence in Amsterdam, Israel tells its citizens not to attend cultural and sporting events abroad this week. Sky News returns to its election target town of Grimsby to see what voters there make of the Prime Minister's first few months in office.
So let's just take a moment to remember our friend Liam.
And pop star Rita Ora leads tributes to Liam Payne at this year's MTV Europe Music Awards. A very good morning to you. Donald Trump has reportedly held a phone call with Vladimir Putin, during which he urged the Russian president not to escalate the war in Ukraine. The Washington Post and Reuters are also reporting that the president-elect reminded the Russian president of America's sizable military presence in Europe during the conversation. That call taking place the day after Mr. Trump's victory, but despite it, there have been reports of blasts in Ukraine's capital overnight, with the power being cut nationwide as a precaution. And now Ukraine's top commander has claimed that Russian forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, are forcing an advance in the Kursk border region. We'll be talking to our correspondent in Moscow, Ivor Bennett, shortly for the latest on that perspective. But first, I'm delighted to say that we're joined by the Defence Secretary, John Healey. A very good morning to you, Defence Secretary. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Why don't we just pick up there rather than today's date in a moment, which we'll get to. And do you think that the safety of Ukraine has fallen since the US election result last week?
No, I don't. The US, alongside the UK, have been two of the leading countries that have been standing by Ukraine, supporting Ukraine. Our determination to do so is just as strong. And I was at a NATO defence ministers just 2 weeks ago when all NATO nations recommitted to stepping up support for Ukraine at this time when they're under pressure, but Russia is weakening.
But does really the only countries within NATO's support that makes a big difference remain the US's support?
It's certainly the case that the US has been the outstanding supporter of Ukraine. And that's because on a bipartisan basis in the US, they recognise the importance of stopping big countries redrawing international boundaries by force and allowing aggressors like Putin to launch illegal invasions. And as far as President Trump goes, he recognises that countries get security through strength, just as alliances like NATO do. And I expect the US to remain alongside allies like the UK, standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes to prevail over Putin's invasion.
I wanted to touch on today, and of course the Prime Minister's travelling to Paris, the first UK Prime Minister to commemorate Armistice Day in France alongside the French President since Churchill in 1944. Why does the Prime Minister feel it's important to go there today?
This is a special year. We mark 80 years since the D-Day invasions and some of the critical battles that liberated Europe and ended the Second World War. And this is also a mark of the close relationship between the two leaders, between Macron and Starmer, but also the historic bonds between our two countries and between our two militaries. So Keir Starmer being the first leader since Churchill to join the French commemorations in Paris of Armistice Day is very fitting. And today of all days, it also reminds us that we can never take the freedoms we enjoy in Europe for granted, particularly at this time of a war in Europe and Putin's aggression towards the West.
I wonder what you feel, Defence Secretary, towards, there's been talk in recent years of a need for conscription, for example, and I wonder whether you feel like my generation, indeed the generation that follows mine, depending on how we define that, lacks the same sense of duty and bravery and commitment that those we are remembering today and this weekend had.
I've had this enormous privilege in the 4 months of doing this job to meet some of the most inspirational people in my life. People in uniform who are really undertaking the ultimate public service, willing to put their lives on the line for the rest of us. So there's no shortage of courage or professionalism in the British forces. What I think there is an increasing, perhaps, lack of full understanding of our forces. After all, last year marked 60 years since the last of the national service generation was discharged. And so I think we need to do more and use remembrance and armistice, not just to recognise the sacrifices of those who gave so much, but also to remind ourselves that peace and freedoms are hard won, must always be defended, and to encourage the new generations to understand better. And I must say, I'm really encouraged. Compared to 10 years ago, I go into schools in my constituency in South Yorkshire, and many more are doing projects, many more are doing pieces of work that help them understand the role of the armed forces today and the sacrifice of those in the past. And
you have, I think I'm right in saying, personal experience of what, I guess, war on Europe's eastern flank can do to inspire a new generation. Your son?
Oh, indeed. It came out of the blue, really, the day after Putin invaded Ukraine back in February 22. Our son came to me and said, Dad, if I was Ukrainian, I'd join up. I'd join up today. And then a few weeks later, he said, I'm going to join the army, I'm going to join the reserves. And that's what he's done. I couldn't be more proud. But as Defence Secretary, it also helps me understand the solemn responsibility that I may have to commit British troops to areas of danger or to conflict. And in doing so, it helps me, I think, understand the feelings of the families that support them, but also carry the anxiety if their loved ones are serving in uniform and protecting the rest of us.
Everyone has commented, Defence Secretary, in recent years, you have yourself in recent months, that this is a more dangerous time that we live in. Do you think it's possible you might have to commit British troops to harm's way in your time as Defence Secretary? Or is that still overwhelmingly unlikely?
It's impossible to predict the future. The importance of having strong armed forces, well equipped to fight, is that they're better able to deter. And deterrence is really the ultimate for a peace-loving democracy like ours and a peace-seeking alliance like NATO. Deterrence, strong deterrence, is the answer to those who would do us harm. And that's why across NATO, not just in the UK, our task as defence ministers and defence leaders is to make our forces better fit to fight, better able to deter, and therefore able to defend ourselves if necessary.
On our own, are our forces strong enough to have that effect right now?
But we're part of an alliance of 32 nations. It's the strongest, most successful alliance in history. And it's an alliance that is stronger still since Putin invaded Ukraine, with Sweden and Finland now full-scale members. And our task as the UK is to continue to be the leading European nation within NATO. I'm determined that we will play that part, and I'm determined that we will give the fullest possible support to those who sign up, serve in our forces, and provide such an inspiration to the rest of us.
If the US, though, did U-turn or even slightly turn away from its commitment to NATO, would we be in a very weak and exposed position?
No, but we wouldn't be in a weak position. I don't expect the US to turn away from NATO. They recognise the importance of the alliance. They recognise the importance of avoiding further conflict in Europe. But I do say, and I've argued for some time, that the European nations in NATO need to do more of the heavy lifting. It's one of the reasons that the UK and Germany have forged now, within 4 months of the becoming a new government, the deep new defence agreement. It's part of reinforcing the European leadership in NATO, and we will play our part in that.
Sorry. Defence Secretary, you say they, the US, believe in NATO. Who is they when you say that? It's all change over there.
No, there's very strong bipartisan support, and the US commitment to NATO goes back decades, and that has remained, including through the previous President Trump administration. Yes, of course, he pushed rightly. He pushed European nations to do more, to fund NATO better. But the US commitment to NATO, to peace and security in the North Atlantic and Western Europe remains as strong. And the recognition of us all as NATO members now is that the security in the Indo-Pacific is indivisible from that of the North Atlantic. So the US has a strong interest in a strong NATO. As I say, President Trump has quite rightly an article of faith. Strength means security. Security and peace achieved through strength.
Obviously, we've just had the budget, Defence Secretary, and I'm not expecting it to be reopened in the short term. But just interested in your insights as to how hard you fought the Chancellor for more money sooner.
Well, I know we've been used under the previous regime of ministers fighting in government and in public with each other. That's not the way we've conducted arrangements. Everybody agrees that defence spending must increase. We've got a government commitment that will set a path to spending 2.5% of our national income on defence, and we've made a start. Next year, the budget for the defence will increase by £3 billion, and that's a sign of a government that recognises the first duty of any government is to defend the country and keep our citizens safe.
Do you think that the US could be more appreciative of the role that the UK does play within NATO, within the continent of Europe, whether that's politically, whether it's diplomatically, or actually, I mean, with bases that they get to use on our soil and our territory? Do you think that is underrepresented in the eyes of America?
I don't. I believe America, right across the political spectrum, and certainly within the military, recognise that the UK is the US's closest security ally. That's been the case for decades, and it will remain. It will remain under this government in the UK. It'll remain under the Trump administration post-election.
Defence Secretary, Israel is warning, according to reports, that there might be more anti-Semitic attacks across Europe, and specifically saying they don't recommend its citizens to travel to foreign sporting events following, of course, what happened in Amsterdam last week. Is there a risk of that in your assessment in the United Kingdom?
If there's any sporting events that may involve Israeli teams, if there's any risk of that, then we as a government and our security forces will be well on top of that and ensuring that we don't see anti-Semitism on our streets and we don't see any sort of violence or abuse.
And just finally, Defence Secretary, again on this day, this weekend of all weekends, just wanted to touch on something you brought up there yourself. But I guess if the day came where you did have to put our troops in harm's way, is that something that you wouldn't pause to do?
It's part of the responsibility of the job that I've taken on as Defence Secretary. It's one that is a heavy responsibility, but an important one for any government, any Defence Secretary. And as a government, we will always do what's necessary to defend this country.
Defence Secretary, thanks so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Of course, today is Armistice Day, and the Prime Minister will be travelling to Paris. In fact, he'd already gone to Paris to commemorate Armistice Day with the French President Emmanuel Macron. That's the first thing on his agenda today. Mari and Molly are both here with me. Mari, striking actually some of the reflections there from the Defence Secretary, the fact that his son, of course, is now a reservist, and it led to a part of the conversation there about the importance of his role, and particularly on this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, politically speaking, it shows that he has skin in the game. And I think that often politicians are accused of being out of touch or not really understanding the impact that their decisions make and have on people. And I think when it comes to that element, actually, it does show that he does understand and appreciate that, because it will affect his own family members as well. And I think people always appreciate that level of understanding, especially, I think, for those who are armed servicemen and women and also veterans, just to know that there is a Defence Secretary who might have an inkling of an understanding of what they go through. I think when it comes to kind of diplomatic relations with the US, I think that section of the interview was really, really interesting. John Healey was very, very insistent that nothing is changing on support for Ukraine. He said, you know, Trump recognises that nations get security from strength, expects the US to remain standing steadfast with Ukraine. Considering the kind of rhetoric we've had out of the Trump team, I think some would argue it's not necessarily quite the same as before. But nonetheless, John Healey is clearly trying to, for now, show that Ukraine has nothing to worry about. NATO is a strong alliance and will back Ukraine up nonetheless. But it is interesting, you know, when you were talking about asking for money for the defence budget, for instance. And he said, oh, you know, we're not like the previous government. We don't argue about these kinds of things. It's all a lot more amicable. I mean, we know that's not the case. We know that cabinet ministers lobby for more money for their departments.
Well, three of them wrote a letter direct to the Prime Minister.
Exactly, Shabana Mahmood, Angela Rayner. You know, the idea that, you know, we don't do these things in front of the camera is, you know, give me a break. But nonetheless, he's trying to say that there is a change in tone for the new government.
Molly, what's on the agenda for the Prime Minister? It's not just Paris.
Yes, we're going to see that 2-minute silence at 11 o'clock held right across the country here in the UK. 11 o'clock, of course, being that moment back in 1918 where the First World War ended and the process of peace, of armistice, that treaty being signed, begun. And we're set to mark that moment to see various different services and ceremonies. The first at 10:45 here in central London on Whitehall at the Cenotaph. And there we'll see a parade with army cadets laying wreath, much of this about, of course, reminding the current generation about what those before them, the sacrifices that they made. And then 5 minutes later at 10:50, the National Arboretum in Staffordshire, that will be led by Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh. There are various other services too at Cardiff Castle, the Cenotaph in Edinburgh and Warwickshire too. But it comes, of course, after yesterday we saw the King lead the nation's tributes down at the Cenotaph. Here, Kate, the Princess of Wales, watching from the Foreign Office balcony, making a rare public appearance. Queen Camilla staying at home on doctor's orders, but thousands of veterans and spectators were there as well, watching on screens. I'm sure we'll see much more of that throughout the day.
And Mari, the Prime Minister, though, has decided to go to Paris en route to Baku for this.
Exactly that, yes. So they're going to pick him up on the way to Baku. But, yeah, he's in Paris today for those commemorations. He was personally invited by President Macron. He's the first UK leader to go to these French commemorations since 1944, during the war when Winston Churchill went and was hosted by Charles de Gaulle. And really, it's a moment, what Number 10 is trying to say anyway, is it's a kind of moment where it's symbolic of a close and enduring friendship between the UK and France. So trying to kind of close those ties again with Europe now that the election's over. We know Labour's been talking a lot about bringing us closer to Paris and Europe. And he's going to be laying a wreath with Macron at war memorials near the Champs-Élysées and also at the tomb of the unknown soldier at the Arc de Triomphe as well. And then he will go on to COP29.
Great stuff, Mari, Molly, thank you. Well, we mentioned there that, of course, the United Nations meeting on climate change, known as COP29, is beginning today in Baku in Azerbaijan. The event has been overshadowed by the re-election of Donald Trump, who calls oil liquid gold. Well, our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, has the latest for us from Baku.
The prediction is that this is going to be one of the toughest negotiations in this bizarre world of climate talks since the Paris Agreement that first agreed to try and limit the world from breaching 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, because this summit is about money and discussions always get complicated when it comes to cash. And hold on to your breakfast, because the numbers we're talking about here are enormous. To transition the world away from fossil fuels by the middle of this century, by 2050, is projected to cost between 125 to 200 trillion dollars. The world needs to come up with a new mechanism to help pay poorer countries not to use fossil fuels to avoid unsustainable global warming, and that money logically has to come from wealthy countries. The idea being they used fossil fuels to become rich and powerful, therefore poorer countries need to have support from them to prevent, in order to not use fossil fuels to grow theirs. So it was already going to be tough, but there are clouds looming over this summit because, as you mentioned, Donald Trump has said he's going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. We've got complications back in Europe, leaders not attending because of politics back there. And on top of that, there are questions about whether Azerbaijan, an oil-rich state and an autocratic one at that, is a fit host for this summit. And we've been looking into that for today's report. The climate talks begin in Baku today under a cloud. America's next president is promising to pull out of the process. Key EU leaders have cancelled attendance, dealing with the political crisis at home. For a negotiation already lagging well behind the pace of our changing climate, is it a fatal blow? Not so, says the man running it.
This year, we had more than 60 countries, elections in more than 60 countries. More than 4 billion people voted. There have been a lot of change, including within the European Union, within other countries. The political landscape has changed, but it has not affected the negotiation process.
If he's right, central to the talks is a deal on climate finance. And host country Azerbaijan is an example of why. Oil and gas beneath Baku and the Caspian Sea beyond make up 90% of its export revenue. The summit wants to see money from countries who've already grown rich by burning fossil fuels to pay for others to transition away from them. Like this. The Garadar solar farm, 15 miles south of Baku, is a vision of a clean energy future for even an oil-rich state like this. Azerbaijan is committed to increase its renewable generation by 30% by 2030, and by quadrupling solar electricity production by building far more big solar farms like this one. It's taking big steps in that direction, but it's also taking bigger steps the opposite way, with plans to increase its oil and gas production by 30% within a decade. So is Azerbaijan, like many other countries at these talks, really committed to a greener future? A cynic would point to Baku's cultural centre, built with $250 million of oil wealth, newly fitted out with electric car chargers. Hasty preparation to clean up the city's image ahead of the climate roadshow. Is Azerbaijan guilty of greenwashing?
If you would ask me that question 2 years ago, I would say greenwashing. But now there is an economical rationale behind it. Reducing local consumption, maintaining export capacity.
One of the reasons Azerbaijan is increasing its fossil fuel production is to meet the demands of Europe, desperate since the war in Ukraine for alternatives to Russian supplies. The same Europe pressuring the world at these talks to reduce emissions faster. The kind of contradiction that explains why progress is so slow and success so far from guaranteed. Tom Clark, Sky News, Baku.
Well, we'll be back out with Tom and the team live in Baku as well during the day, and indeed have a debate at 1/2 the hour in terms of what can be gained from COP this time around. But for now, time for all the day's other news. Leah's got that for us. Hey, Leah.
Morning, everyone at home. The Israeli government has told its citizens not to attend cultural or sporting events abroad over the next week, following recent violence in Amsterdam. Now, the office of Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, claims it has intelligence that pro-Palestinian groups intended to harm Israelis in foreign cities, including in the UK. Our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle has the details.
We know that there is a big high-profile football game going on later next week between France and Israel, so that will be the subject of a lot of scrutiny and heightened security, given the events that happened in Amsterdam just a few days ago, when both sides clashed. There was Israeli supporters, we believe, who had ripped down a Palestinian flag ahead of a match between Maccabi Tel Aviv and Ajax, and then following the match, many of the Israeli supporters were attacked, chased through the streets of Amsterdam. Some of them ended up in hospital in a very serious instance. So there's a lot of concern that there might be a repeat of that. The fact that this warning has come from the Israeli Prime Minister's office carries considerable weight to it, and they have cited a number of European countries, including Britain and France. But the Israeli Prime Minister's office haven't elaborated on what their intelligence is. As I say, neither have the security services here, nor have any of the European agencies or the governments who have been singled out as a potential flashpoint for trouble for Israelis in those countries.
The Home Office has told Sky News there's no place for anti-Semitism on our streets, and we will not allow cultural and sporting events to be hijacked by those who seek to promote hate. They go on to say those who push this poison offline and online will face the full force of the law. Police and the security services continue to work to ensure the safety of every community in this country. One person has died and 16 others have been injured in a shooting at a university in Alabama. The attack happened on the last day of homecoming week at Tuskegee University. Authorities say a 25-year-old man has been arrested and charged with a federal offence. Toy company Mattel has apologised for mistakenly printing the address for a porn website on the packaging of its Wicked dolls. Mattel said it deeply regrets the error and has taken action to remove the dolls from circulation. Now, it's been a difficult start for the Labour government with a budget that wasn't exactly as advertised in the run-up to the election. The party's plans to rebuild Britain without raising taxes was a point of contention between Sir Keir Starmer and the audience of our election leaders event back in June. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, has travelled back to Grimsby, one of our target towns, to see what voters there make of the PM's performance so far.
Grimsby and Cleethorpes on the Humber Estuary, home to Sky News' election target towns, and one of the seats that helped tip the balance for Starmer on the 5th of July. Welcome to Grimsby Town Hall, where we're joined tonight by the two men vying for the keys to Downing Street. Sharon, hi. It's so nice to see you again. Thank you for coming along. So we're back to catch up with some of the voters who put their questions at the Sky News Leaders event. Sharon, Cayman and Amy. A few months in, Keir Starmer's first budget's finally given the contours of Labour's plans, and it's not exactly as advertised before people went to the polls.
No tax rises in the next Parliament.
No tax rises needed in the plans in our manifesto.
In the plans.
No tax rises for working people.
Lifelong Labour voter Sharon wanted to know if Starmer really wouldn't put up taxes in order to invest.
How it's all going to be funded? If taxes are not going up, how are you going to fund it?
We need to put money and resource into Grimsby. We need resource decision-making to come.
That was the question, Sharon, wasn't it? How are you going to fund it?
Yeah, absolutely. And following the budget, I actually think I've been indirectly taxed.
I couldn't bring myself to vote for Keir because I was worried that things like this may happen. You know, he wants to bring the growth into the country. How have we done that? By, putting the burden on businesses to grow.
For Cayman, a question foreshadowing the concerns that have plagued the early days of Starmer's premiership.
You seem more like a political robot. Well, for most of...
Has he loosened up a bit since Cayman?
I feel like he's still a robot, yeah.
Still robotic.
Still robotic, yeah.
The jury's still very much out on this new government after a budget that came as a surprise to voters and to the Labour MP who won this seat for Starmer. In the days after the budget, taxes going up for small businesses in Grimsby, were you surprised by it?
I was, which I've been told not to keep saying.
It's been a difficult start for Starmer, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think you'd be, a bit blind to say that you hadn't seen a bit of a rocky start.
A political landslide that stands on shaky ground. Starmer gambling that his big budget will pay off and persuade voters about him and his government. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Great Grimsby.
Really amazing package that for Beth, and there's a longer version of it as well on the Sky News website and app. Well worth checking that out. Lots more still to come here with Leah and I on The Breakfast Show. Coming up, what impact will another Trump presidency have on efforts to combat global warming at COP? We'll discuss that.
And tributes are paid to One Direction singer Liam Payne at the MTV Europe Music Awards.
We've come to one of Moscow's Cold War bunkers. It was built as a top-secret command centre. Being here really feels like you're stepping back in time. I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent. A show of military might and menace.
Courage, bravery and sacrifice will win the day.
It's a new subject. They'll learn about combat drones and some how to handle a Kalashnikov.
The Kremlin continues to put forward its own version of events, both present and past.
There's no mention of the fact that Russia invaded its neighbour. That's rewriting history, isn't it?
Now we are to read it carefully.
Vladimir Putin put forward his plan for a ceasefire in Ukraine, telling Kiev, pull out of your eastern territories and the war will end. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Vladimir Putin is already the Kremlin's longest-serving leader since Stalin. The question is, what will a fifth Putin term mean for Russia and the world? Why do you support Vladimir Putin, Mr. Segal?
I can't answer questions that stupid.
I've watched Vladimir Putin attempt to create a new world order.
The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was the backdrop to Vladimir Putin's latest verbal volley that Russia could send missiles to other nations to target the West. Ambassador, I wonder, shall we have a quick word for Sky News? Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine?
Swedish media, oh my God, you're not afraid of being here.
American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, but was first on display.
Russia says Evan Gershkovich was caught red-handed, but has never produced any evidence to back that up. Sky News. Get the full story first.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
Welcome back to The Breakfast Show. Well, coming up, we'll be having a debate about COP and what it can and can't achieve if it's still fit for purpose. But first, a reminder of all the day's top stories. Leah's got those for us.
Thank you, Wilfred. Just a reminder that we're covering today on Sky News Breakfast. Donald Trump has urged Vladimir Putin not to escalate the war in Ukraine in a phone call the day after the presidential election. That's according to reports. Elsewhere, the United Nations meeting on climate change, known as COP29, begins in Baku today. The summit has largely been overshadowed by the re-election of Donald Trump, who calls oil liquid gold. Sir Keir Starmer will travel to Paris for today's Armistice Day event. He'll be the first Prime Minister to mark the day in France since Sir Winston Churchill during the Second World War. And the Israeli government has told its citizens not to attend cultural or sporting events abroad over the next week, including here in the UK, following recent violence in Amsterdam.
Thanks so much. Let's return now to the start of the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Baku. Donald Trump's re-election, of course, casting a shadow over the summit after promising to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement once again. So what impact could the President-elect have on the summit, and is it still fit for purpose? Let's discuss now with Harry Wilkinson. He's head of policy at the Global Warming Policy Foundation and Professor of Climate Law at the University of Reading, Professor Benoit Meyer. Thank you both for joining us. Very good morning to you both.
Morning.
I'll start with you, Benoit, if I can, in terms of just break down for us what COP is meant to achieve each year and what's on the agenda this year.
Well, in 2015, states agreed on some objectives, global emission reduction objective of trying to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees as far as possible. And now it's just about transforming a goal into a plan and then into reality. So it's about trying to find a target for each state that would be consistent with this objective.
And what is the sort of process at the summit in terms of getting these types of agreements? Does every country have to unanimously agree, or is it always a sort of loose communique that's kind of agreed upon?
It depends. Some of the decisions have to be adopted by consensus. Any decision of the COP has to be adopted by consensus. But then each party, each state will provide a nationally determined contribution, which is a target for itself. And that doesn't have to be accepted by others. So no state will be forced to take on a target beyond what they accept to take.
Harry, with that in mind, does having these types of gatherings annually, when we know each country, as highlighted last week in the US, is going to see political leadership change so often, is that the right approach for the long term on this, or is there going to be no perfect solution and we have to kind of go with whatever we can agree on?
Well, what we've seen with COPs over the years is more and more new targets. We see them both at national level and international level, and I think that's gone too far. You know, we've got to get back to the basics, which is how do we decarbonise and how do we do that affordably. One thing that Trump seems to understand is the importance of affordable, cheap energy in the United States. And that, you know, he said, drill, baby, drill. He's clearly taking a different approach than we will hear from many other world leaders, and that's going to put him in conflict. But actually, cheap energy, abundant energy, that has to be the heart of a revitalised approach to this issue, because, you know, we look at the UK and we see that we have the most expensive electricity prices in the world. Developing countries, how can they copy that? They can't subsidise renewables to the extent that we can, but if we can pioneer new technologies that get the cost of energy down, then we can see technologies that really have the potential to change how we produce energy at the global level.
Benoit, what's your view on that and Donald Trump's rhetoric in particular? Does the COP gathering need to embrace him and sort of not necessarily follow him, but not criticise him, or kind of hold America away for 4 years?
Well, I think we have seen 3 times already the US deciding not to join the climate treaty. First time was in Kyoto, and it took several years for states to accept that, OK, we're going to implement the Kyoto Protocol without the US. The second time was 2016, the first election of President Trump. And it took a few days for states to accept, OK, the EU and China are going to take the lead, and we are going to implement the treaty with or without the US. This time, I think there is no question. The Paris Agreement will be implemented. The COP negotiation will keep going on. The only difference is that, well, a country representing about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions will not really be active during those negotiations. It will still be taking action. There will be action from the bottom up, from California, from New York, and so on. The US companies will keep implementing emission reduction measures. But the US will lose its opportunity to influence those negotiations.
Harry, clearly there's a lot of factors at play in the US election. Impossible for us to say exactly what drove people to vote certain ways. But I think it's also fair to say that in the US, climate is politicised along political lines in a way that in a lot of Europe, including in the UK, despite some politicisation of it in the last year or so, there's broad consensus to want to decarbonise. Should some other countries take note of what's happened in the US in terms of pushing the boundaries of moving towards decarbonisation?
I think so. I think the politicisation in the UK has increased. One thing is the objective, should we decarbonise? The other question, of course, is how do we do that and what the impacts of the decarbonisation policies that we're addressing. We've seen a spate of policies that are being planned for the future, regulating the cars people drive, how they heat their homes. These are big, important decisions that will change people's lives. And so it's so important for politicians to engage with what that means for people, rather than pressing ahead and saying, this is all the consensus, this must be agreed upon. They have to get that democratic consensus. And we haven't seen that. We've heard Kemi Badenoch, the new leader of the Conservative Party, increasingly raising questions about how the net zero target was introduced in the first place and whether it really did have the kind of scrutiny that it should have had. And so I think that debate will continue to open up. That's a good thing because we have to go into the detail of these policies, what they mean and whether there's a better way.
Benoit, what does success look like at this COP?
Well, success would be states taking on more ambitious targets and finding ways to implement them. I agree with Harry that we need to reduce the price of electricity as a major issue for everyone watching us today. But I do believe that this is to be done by decarbonising the energy sector. Today, the price of electricity in the UK is mostly due to the price of natural gas. The issue is that we still have 40% of our electricity in the UK from natural gas and 60% from renewable energy and nuclear energy. If we increase the share of renewable energy, we will have a lower price of electricity.
How quickly can that be achieved?
10, 15 years in the UK.
And do you think that at that point, I guess it's not even a question of what happens at that point. What happens in the meantime? Does energy prices stay high during that transition?
I think the prices will start going down quite quickly. The price of, once you have a solar panel or a windmill, it costs nothing to have electricity. It's just the first investment. And we have done most of that investment. We have 60% of the energy from non-fossil fuel energy. The issue at the moment is the marginal demand for electricity at peak hour. And that can be achieved. We can reduce that price with more storage, with hydrogen production and so on. And that's being done as we speak.
Harry, final word in terms of what do you think success at this COP looks like?
Well, I would say, just coming back on what was said before, we have the most expensive industrial and domestic electricity prices in the world at the moment. That hasn't been working. That's been alongside a huge renewable expansion. What would a COP29 process that was good look like? I would say, let's simplify the process and actually make it more about engaging competition, because that is the well from which we can have, cheap energy technologies. That has to be at the heart of it. We saw the Inflation Reduction Act under the Biden administration, and that was all about huge subsidies for all sorts of green technologies. Developing countries can't replicate that. So that's not the kind of approach that can have a global success.
Harry and Benoit, thank you both so much for joining us. Very good to see you both. Returning to our top story and reports that Donald Trump urged Vladimir Putin not to escalate the war in Ukraine in a phone call the day after the presidential election. It comes, of course, as reports overnight of further attacks on Kiev in Ukraine. Let's bring in our correspondent, Ivor Bennett, who joins us from Moscow. Ivor, what has happened overnight, and what do you make of the comment from the Defence Secretary to me earlier on that Ukraine's safety has not diminished in any way since the result of the US election?
Yeah, morning, Wilf. So we knew there was going to be a call at some point between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, given the Kremlin's overtures towards the president-elect at the end of last week. And it seems it has already happened. Both the Washington Post in the US and the Reuters news agency are reporting this call took place. The Washington Post saying it took place on Thursday, much earlier than everyone thought, of course. At that time, the Kremlin was saying that Vladimir Putin had no plans to make this call. Ukraine, we're told, was discussed, with Donald Trump saying, or urging, apparently, Vladimir Putin not to escalate the conflict and reminding him of America's sizable military presence in Europe. Now, these comments, or that first readout of this first contact between the two leaders post-election, I think will ease some of the concerns in Ukraine and amongst its Western allies, but not all of them. Ukraine is deeply concerned about Donald Trump's stance on the conflict because of what because of what else he said on the campaign trail consistently. Over the last 12, 18 months, he has repeatedly vowed to bring the war to a swift close and has also repeatedly criticised US military spending and aid to Kyiv. If that is cut, he strongly intimated it will be, then that will potentially force Ukraine into negotiations with Russia, but in a very weakened position, giving Russia the upper hand on the battlefield, of course, but most importantly on the negotiating table as well, potentially seeing them, Ukraine being forced to cede territory to Russia. So Ukraine and its allies are very concerned how this relationship between Putin and Trump will develop. They got on very well last time, of course. There was all this talk of bromance. And there it appears that Moscow wants to rekindle that relationship with Vladimir Putin saying last week that Donald Trump was very brave during that assassination attempt. He flattered him and said that Moscow was open to dialogue, but he did not water down Moscow's demands. They are still insisting that Ukraine must abandon its ambitions to join NATO. And also, if there is any peace deal, it must involve Ukraine ceding the 4 territories that Moscow holds, either partially or wholly. So I think there will be a lot of concern still in Ukraine and Western capitals about how this relationship develops. We haven't had any formal readout yet from the Russian side of this contact, but we understand that the current White House administration, President Biden, of course, will meet Donald Trump later this week. Ukraine will come up, and we're told that he will urge Donald Trump not to abandon Kyiv.
Ivor, thanks so much. Now, the music industry has remembered One Direction singer Liam Payne as stars gathered for the MTV Europe Music Awards in Manchester. Rita Ora, who was presenting the show for a third time, was tearful as she paid tribute to him. Our arts and entertainment correspondent, Katie Spencer, has this report.
A poignant moment at the MTV EMAs. In One Direction, Liam Payne won countless awards at this annual music celebration. Almost a month on from his death in Argentina, many who knew him well, like host Rita Ora, stopped to remember.
Liam Payne was one of the kindest people that I knew. Yeah.
This the first big gathering of music's great and good since the industry lost one of its own. Even Jedward, who came through X Factor like Payne did, struggling to maintain their usual lightness.
And we came from the same TV show, so it's the fact that we've all kind of been in the same race. A lot of artists are going through a personal struggle. A lot of musicians, they don't realise that it's not all glitz and glam. You have your highs, your lows, but you have to be content with your success. And like, we're never the hottest thing, we're never like the most whatever, but we always still turn up for ourselves.
This is my song called Body Dysmorphia. It's a song about hating the way that you look. And it goes like this. I let my fingers pinch my skin. I'm so hungry, I can't sleep.
A seductive power to fame, but this level of attention, this life, by no means an easy one. Ray singing about the pressures of maintaining a certain body image. As the party comes to Manchester, while the flashbulbs are pointed at the stars, here, what happens off stage within the music industry is coming under focus like never before. Including the wisdom of mixing pop and politics after many stars endorsed Kamala Harris in the US election race.
No, I think everyone has to do what's right for them, you know what I mean? We're all like human beings at the end of the day. So I feel like as long as you kind of speak for what you believe in, then what else can you do?
Focus here tonight on performances as well as the prizes. But with so much to grapple with, it's not exactly a winning time for the wider music industry. Katie Spencer, Sky News in Manchester.
Lots more to come here on The Breakfast Show. Well, as the country marks Armistice Day, I'll be joined by a veteran who served 25 years with the Royal Navy.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. Alex Crawford joining us now from Ukraine.
Their personal possessions are all scattered around the place.
Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, try and make sense of the big numbers for us.
Things can change incredibly quickly, and that's what they have done.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news. The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Trust in politics is at an all-time low. What's going wrong and can we fix it? It's from Liz. She wants to know, why is there still no sign of the Labour Party electing a woman as leader?
It's sort of embarrassing. You know, it takes a very strong man to be leader, but it takes an even stronger man to support a woman for leader.
If you want to be mean to politicians, like, crack on. The activists that go out and make elections happen, I kind of feel like just don't be horrible to them. Be polite to them in the same way that they're polite to you.
Keir Starmer has got us into government with a big majority. He was completely clear before the election that he wasn't going to be able to do the two-child benefit policy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't an early thing that comes along.
I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello? No, yes, what is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking land. Let me see it. This is brilliant.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world, the likes of Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Sir Elton John. We try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away.
So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Now, the country will fall silent at 11 o'clock this morning as people around the country pay tribute to those who made the ultimate sacrifice. I'm delighted to say that joining us now is veteran and clinical advisor at Help for Heroes, Janine Whitley. Janine, thanks so much for joining us. And first and foremost, thank you for your service, which spanned 25 years and 4 tours of Afghanistan?
It did, and it flew.
It did, and it what, sorry?
It flew. It went really quickly.
Well, that's good to hear, because I'm sure it was an enormous challenge. And I mean, how did it fly by? I guess it's because of that sense of service.
It did. I joined the Navy at 16 and managed to go through the ranks. And I joined as a Wren and transferred to the nursing branch probably about 7 years into my career. So I was able to actually have a really good career out of the service that I had. And
you recently were honoured for this with the Cavell Star Award, named after a renowned World War I nurse, an award you obviously richly deserved but had no idea was coming your way, is that right?
That's totally true. I was really shocked because, to be honest, any of my team around the country who does my job could have got that award because it's a really, really good team. But I guess it's a privilege, and to be able to have done the tours in Afghanistan, seen the impact of what conflict does, and then do a full circle, join Help for Heroes and be able to provide the service we do to veterans to help them move forward later on, it's really special.
Janine, I wonder if we just touch on that illustrious career that Wilfred mentioned there. 25 years in the Navy, 4 tours of Afghanistan. When you reflect back on that career, what stays with you the most?
Friendships, if I'm honest, because you can be in the worst place experiencing the worst things, but if you've got your comrades, your friends around you, you can achieve anything, really. And obviously, in my 4 tours of Afghanistan, there were some really poignant moments where looking after people that had been injured, you want to do the best for the families. So that, that was really memorable, I guess, on a day like today, where you look at the whole sort of period.
And then what does today mean to you after such a long career and also, starting in the Navy when you were just 16?
I think partly because of this job, it reminds me that it wasn't just about the world wars. There's lots of conflicts like Northern Ireland, Aden, Falklands that really impact people. So I come from a bit of a different lens now, not just because I've done service, but because there's lots of people out there who needs a lot more support around how those conflicts and being in the forces have affected them and impacted them later on in their lives. So today's really poignant, it's really special, and I think it's something that for all veterans and their families is really important, because behind every veteran there's lots and lots of family. So mine were really impacted from my tours, going away, what I'd seen.
Well, Janine, again, we thank you for your service, and we thank your family as well for putting up, and take your time on this if you need be, but it's why you believe so strongly in Help for Heroes.
Yeah, it is, because I think they recognise that service can impact people in so many ways, like really good impacts. Like, I've had a brilliant career, but there are times when it can impact people in not so good ways. And there's so much support that veterans can get now from Help for Heroes and from other charities that can help them move forward. So, I work daily with people who struggle with what they've been through and how to move forward, whether it's with physical health or with mental health. And I think that's probably the biggest message from this, if I could say it, is that please reach out, because there is help out there.
Janine, we thank you so much for your time today. We thank you even more so for your service this day of all days. That does it for us this hour. We'll be back at the top of the hour with all of the day's top stories.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Good morning. It's 8 o'clock coming up on today's show. Ukraine is attacked overnight, despite Donald Trump reportedly telling Vladimir Putin not to escalate the war.
Plus, the Prime Minister heads to Paris to spend Armistice Day with France's President Emmanuel Macron.
And we'll be live at the UN Climate Summit, where countries are looking at how to raise up to $200 trillion to help tackle our warming planet.
It's Monday, the 11th of November. Your headlines. More attacks on Ukraine overnight, despite Donald Trump reportedly urging Vladimir Putin not to escalate the war. Here in the UK, confidence that Mr. Trump will stand by Kiev.
I expect the US to remain alongside allies like the UK, standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes to prevail over Putin's invasion.
Climate finance top of the agenda at COP as developing nations demand support for decarbonising their rapidly growing economies. Sir Keir Starmer heads to Paris for Armistice Day, the first Prime Minister to do so since Sir Winston Churchill.
Following the budget, I actually think I've been indirectly taxed.
Sky News returns to its election target town of Grimsby, where voters are less than impressed by the Prime Minister's first few months in office.
So let's just take a moment to remember our friend Liam.
And pop star Rita Ora leads tributes to Liam Payne at this year's MTV Europe Music Awards. A very good morning to you. The Defence Secretary has told Sky News he expects Donald Trump to continue support for Ukraine for as long as it takes. John Healey was speaking to me following overnight strikes in Ukraine and reports of a phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin during a call apparently urging the Russian president not to escalate the war. The Washington Post and Reuters are also reporting that the president-elect reminded the Russian president of America's sizable military presence in Europe during the conversation. But despite that call, there have been reports of blast in Ukraine overnight, with the power being cut nationwide as a precaution. Despite all that, Mr. Healey told me he expected US support to remain in place for Ukraine. Do you think that the safety of Ukraine has fallen since the US election result last week?
No, I don't. The US, alongside the UK, have been two of the leading countries that have been standing by Ukraine, supporting Ukraine. Our determination to do so is just as strong. And I was at a NATO defence ministers just 2 weeks ago when all NATO nations recommitted to stepping up support for Ukraine at this time when they're under pressure, but Russia is weakening.
But does really the only countries within NATO's support that makes a big difference remain the US's support?
It's certainly the case that the US has been the outstanding supporter of Ukraine. And that's because on a bipartisan basis in the US, they recognise the importance of stopping big countries redrawing international boundaries by force and allowing aggressors like Putin to launch illegal invasions. And as far as President Trump goes, he recognises that countries get security through strength, just as alliances like NATO do. And I expect the US to remain alongside allies like the UK, standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes to prevail over Putin's invasion.
The Defence Secretary last hour there. Well, let's bring in Ivor Bennett, who joins us now live from Moscow. Ivor, quite a perhaps surprising but certainly resolute belief there from the Defence Secretary that the President-elect in the US will remain committed to Ukraine.
Yeah, morning, Wilf. Surprising in some senses, yes, but I think these comments reflect two things. One, that no one really knows what Donald Trump's stance is going to be yet on Ukraine, despite what he said on the campaign trail. Yes, he's vowed to bring the conflict to a swift end, sparking fears that he's going to cut military aid to Ukraine, push them into negotiations with a favourable outcome for Moscow. But he hasn't said how he's going to do it, and he hasn't explicitly said what peace will look like. So I think Ukraine and its allies, like the UK, are trying to talk up and urge the US to continue its support of Kyiv and to stand by and not abandon Ukraine. So that's one thing. And I think the second one reflects the realistic fact that the UK has to do business with the US for the next 4 years. Things aren't going to change. He's going to be in the White House for the next 4 years, and so they have to get on with him. And so obviously John Healey's not going to say anything too critical of the president-elect. So he's, I think, putting a brave face on things. And overnight, of course, we've had these reports that Donald Trump has had a phone call with Vladimir Putin. This reportedly happened on Thursday, the day after the election result, and he reportedly obviously brought up Ukraine, and we're told he urged Vladimir Putin not to escalate the conflict and reminded him of America's sizable military presence in Europe. Those comments, that first readout of this first contact, I think will ease these concerns about what his stance will be to some degree. But as I say, no one really knows what he's going to do next. There is a lot of unpredictability about this, and I think Ukraine especially will be anxious to see how Donald Trump's relationship develops with Vladimir Putin. They got on very well last time around, of course, when Donald Trump was in office. And at the end of last week, Vladimir Putin made some comments that suggested he wanted to rekindle that relationship. He was very flattering of Donald Trump. He congratulated him on his election results, said he was bullied last time he was in office, and he said he showed great bravery during his assassination attempt, really trying to appeal to his image as a tough leader. And I think so there's a lot of concern to see how these two will get on. But this first readout of this first contact, I think, is in the direction that Ukraine and its allies want things to go, which is for the US to stand by Ukraine. But as I say, we really don't know what he's going to do next, of course.
Ivor, as always, thanks so much, Ivor Bennett, for us there in Moscow. Of course, the other reason the Defence Secretary was with us earlier is because it's Armistice Day, a remembrance of the agreement to end the First World War on the 11th of November 1918. And I asked the Defence Secretary about the commemorations and his views on that.
And so I think we need to do more and use remembrance and armistice, not just to recognise the sacrifices of those who gave so much, but also to remind ourselves that peace and freedoms are hard won, must always be defended, and to encourage the new generations to understand better. And I must say, I'm really encouraged. Compared to 10 years ago, I go into schools in my constituency in South Yorkshire, and many more are doing projects, many more are doing pieces of work that help them understand the role of the armed forces today and the sacrifice of those in the past.
Well, Molly and Mari are here with us to discuss some of the details from that interview. But also, Molly, just take us through what's on the agenda today for Armistice Day.
Yeah, so we're set to see a 2-minute silence being held at 11 o'clock right across the UK. Of course, 11 o'clock being the time back in 1918 where the First World War came to an end and that process of peace, of armistice, begun. And to mark that moment, to mark the many who lost their lives in conflicts that have gone by since, we're set to see a series of ceremonies and services across the country today. The first starting just around the corner from here, down Whitehall at the Cenotaph at 10:45. There we're going to see the laying of many wreaths, Army cadets laying wreaths. Much of this, of course, about reminding the current and future generations of the sacrifices that were made during those wars, during those conflicts. And then 5 minutes later at the National Arboretum in Staffordshire, we're going to see another service led by Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh. There are other services too at Cardiff Castle, another in Edinburgh and Warwickshire. And it comes, of course, of yesterday. We saw the King leading the nation's tributes at the Cenotaph. Kate, the Princess of Wales, making that rare public appearance. She's been battling cancer. She was watching their ceremony from the Foreign Office balcony. The Queen, Camilla, watching it at home on doctor's orders. She had a chest infection. They were joined by thousands of veterans and spectators together watching on screens, and we're set to see much more of that throughout the course of today.
But Mari, the Prime Minister's not going to be in London.
No, he is in France. He's going to be in Paris. So he was personally invited by President Macron to commemorate the 106th anniversary of Armistice Day in Paris. So Number 10 have kind of really touted this as a bit of a symbol of the kind of connection and the friendship between the UK and France. Keir Starmer was the first leader, the first UK leader to do this since 1944, when Winston Churchill went over to France at the invitation of Charles de Gaulle. And also, he's going to be laying wreaths similarly, but in Paris, of course. So he's going to be doing that with Macron at war memorials near the Champs-Élysées, but also at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at the Arc de Triomphe as well. And there's going to be a bit of collaboration, UK-French collaboration, because there's going to be the British Band of Rifles that's going to be a part of that ceremony as well. And actually, interestingly, before that, they're actually going to have a bilateral agreement, meeting, between Macron and Starmer, where we're expecting them actually not just to talk about the commemorations, of course, but actually to talk about foreign policy, specifically on Gaza, specifically on Ukraine. We know we've been talking about that so much this morning, and presumably and inevitably on tariffs and the possibility of tariffs.
And what everything the recent US election result means, of course, for all of this. Just on that note, Mari, talk to me about your take on not all of the interview with the Defence Secretary, but particularly the debate about defence spending. There's been a lot of fallout since the budget, and we know that everyone always fights for more money for their department, regardless of what people say. Politically, when you assess the fallout from the budget, have they lost points by not boosting defence spending faster? It's probably not the key agenda in people's minds, even if perhaps it should be, particularly in light of the US election results.
I think for now, they can probably get away with saying we are going to get to that 2.5% in the future when we have the money. The difficulty is if things start to change now that President-elect Trump will become president very soon, and things start to change globally when it comes to support for Ukraine, when it comes to pressure on NATO allies to spend more, that could potentially shift the way that things change. There's been reporting that potentially it's going to take 10 years to get to that 2.5%. We're about 2.3 at the moment, whereas the Conservatives have always said that they would have done it within one parliament. The Labour Party won't admit or kind of commit to that. And I think depending on what happens globally, there might be that ratcheting up of pressure. But for now, it's more of a Westminster pressure.
Mari, Molly, thank you both so much. Now, the United Nations meeting on climate change, known as COP29, starts in Azerbaijan today. But the event has been overshadowed by the re-election of Donald Trump, who, of course, calls oil liquid gold. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, is at COP29 at the capital of Azerbaijan, Baku. Great to see you, Tom. Good morning to you. What is top of the agenda for this COP?
Good morning. Well, it's money. And this summit is potentially the most consequential and certainly the most tricky since 2016 when the Paris Agreement was passed. Because, it's dealing with cash and the fact that in order to address the issue of climate change, wealthy nations who've burnt lots of fossil fuels to develop their economies are expecting developing countries whose economies want to grow to do so without producing the same emissions that are leading to even more rapidly increasing global warming. So there has to be a mechanism where those wealthy countries transfer money to poorer ones to prevent that from happening. That's been agreed in principle, but the mechanism by which that happens and the amounts of money we are talking about. So it was a hard-fought battle to get $100 billion a year approved. It took way longer than expected. Now we're talking about $1 to $2 trillion a year that needs to flow in that direction. How does that even work? What does it look like? That is the sort of detail about how public money, multilateral banks and private sector capital come together to sort of finance this transition, which is so necessary, as the floods in places like Valencia and the US remind us. But how are they going to work? And that's really how this summit will be judged, whether it's a success or not, whether they can come up with some kind of mechanism to do that.
The climate talks begin in Baku today under a cloud. America's next president is promising to pull out of the process. Key EU leaders have cancelled attendance, dealing with the political crisis at home. For a negotiation already lagging well behind the pace of our changing climate, is it a fatal blow? Not so, says the man running it.
This year, we had more than 60 countries, elections in more than 60 countries. More than 4 billion people voted. There have been a lot of change, including within the European Union, within other countries. The political landscape has changed, but it has not affected the negotiation process.
If he's right, central to the talks is a deal on climate finance. And host country Azerbaijan is an example of why. Oil and gas beneath Baku and the Caspian Sea beyond make up 90% of its export revenue. The summit wants to see money from countries who've already grown rich by burning fossil fuels to pay for others to transition away from them. Like this. The Garadar solar farm, 15 miles south of Baku, is a vision of a clean energy future for even an oil-rich state like this.
Azerbaijan is committed to increase its renewable generation by 30% by 2030. And by quadrupling solar electricity production by building far more big solar farms like this one. It's taking big steps in that direction, but it's also taking bigger steps the opposite way with plans to increase its oil and gas production by 30% within a decade.
So is Azerbaijan, like many other countries at these talks, really committed to a greener future? A cynic would point to Baku's cultural centre, built with $250 million of oil wealth, newly fitted out with electric car chargers. Hasty preparation to clean up the city's image ahead of the climate roadshow.
Is Azerbaijan guilty of greenwashing?
If you would ask me that question 2 years ago, I would say greenwashing. But now there is an economical rationale behind it. Reducing local consumption, maintaining export capacity.
One of the reasons Azerbaijan is increasing its fossil fuel production is to meet the demands of Europe, desperate since the war in Ukraine for alternatives to Russian supplies. The same Europe pressuring the world at these talks to reduce emissions faster. The kind of contradiction that explains why progress is so slow and success so far from guaranteed.
Tom Clark there for us. And of course, the Prime Minister gets to the COP summit in Baku later today after Armistice celebrations or remembrance services in Paris, first of all. Time for all of those other top stories now. Leah's got those for us.
Thank you, Wilfred. The Israeli government has told its citizens not to attend cultural or sporting events abroad over the next week following recent violence in Amsterdam. The office of Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, claims it has intelligence that pro-Palestinian groups intended to harm Israelis in foreign cities, including in the UK. Let's read out that Home Office statement then for you. There is no place, they say, for anti-Semitism on our streets, and we will not allow cultural and sporting events to be hijacked by those who seek to promote hate. They go on to say those who push this poison offline and online will face the full force of the law. Police and security services continue to work to ensure the safety of every community in this country. Elsewhere, one person has died and 16 others have been injured in a shooting at a university in Alabama. The attack happened on the last day of homecoming week at Tuskegee University. Authorities say a 25-year-old man has been arrested and charged with a federal offence. The toy company Mattel has apologised for mistakenly printing the addresses for porn websites on the packaging of its Wicked dolls. Mattel said it deeply regrets the error and has taken action to remove the dolls from circulation. And it's been a difficult start for the Labour government with a budget that wasn't exactly as advertised in the run-up to the election. The party's plans to rebuild Britain without raising taxes was a point of contention between Sir Keir Starmer and the audience of our election leaders event. That was back in June. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, has travelled to Grimsby, one of our target towns, to see what voters there make of the PM's performance so far.
Grimsby and Cleethorpes on the Humber Estuary, home to Sky News' election target towns, and one of the seats that helped tip the balance for Starmer on the 5th of July.
Welcome to Grimsby Town Hall, where we're joined tonight by the two men vying for the keys to Downing Street. Sharon, hi. It's so nice to see you again. Thank you for coming along.
So we're back to catch up with some of the voters who put their questions at the Sky News Leaders event. Sharon, Cayman and Amy. A few months in, Keir Starmer's first budget's finally given the contours of Labour's plans, and it's not exactly as advertised before people went to the polls.
No tax rises in the next Parliament.
No tax rises needed in the plans in our manifesto.
In the plans.
No tax rises for working people.
Lifelong Labour voter Sharon wanted to know if Starmer really wouldn't put up taxes in order to invest.
Our
be funded? If taxes are not going up, how are you going to fund it?
We need to put money and resource into Grimsby. We need resource decision-making to come.
That was the question, Sharon, wasn't it? How are you going to fund it?
Yeah, absolutely. And following the budget, I actually think I've been indirectly taxed.
I couldn't bring myself to vote for Keir because I was worried that things like this may happen. You know, he wants to bring the growth into the country. How have we done that? By, you know, putting the burden on businesses to grow.
For Payne, a question foreshadowing the concerns that have plagued the early days of Starmer's premiership.
You seem more like a political robot. Well, for most of...
Has he loosened up a bit since Payne?
I feel like he's still a robot, yeah.
Still robotic.
Still robotic, yeah.
The jury's still very much out on this new government after a budget that came as a surprise to voters and to the Labour MP who won this seat for Starmer. In the days after the budget, taxes going up for small businesses in Grimsby, were you surprised by it?
I was, which I've been told not to keep saying.
It's been a difficult start for Starmer, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think you'd be, you know, a bit blind to say that you hadn't seen a bit of a rocky start.
A political landslide that stands on shaky ground. Starmer gambling that his big budget will pay off and persuade voters about him and his government. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Great Grimsby.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, there's a longer version of Beth's package on the Sky News website as well. Time to talk to the Conservatives, and I'm joined now by the MP for Grantham and Bourne, Gareth Davis, who's the Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. Interview this morning with the Defence Secretary, who quite clearly felt that the US election doesn't change the safety of Ukraine, was the word I used. Did the Conservative Party agree with that?
Well, look, our position on Ukraine hasn't changed. We've changed leader, but our position hasn't. That we must and will support Ukraine in anything they need. When we're in office, obviously, as you know, we provided significant military support through training and equipment, as well as aid for its people. And critical to resolving this conflict is working with our key ally, the United States. And we have confidence that the United Kingdom can work with the United States to that end, and would encourage Keir Starmer, as our new Prime Minister, to engage with President-elect Trump to that end.
Is it short-sighted of the Defence Secretary to say nothing's changed? It's not quite what his words were, but to assume that because there was bipartisan support in the last year, ultimately, despite some toing and froing for Ukraine, that will continue? Or do you think, realistically speaking, the prospects for Ukraine of getting more funding from the US have fallen?
I think I would take that in two parts. First of all, President-elect Trump isn't yet in office, and I think it is right that our Defence Secretary, from whichever party, set out that we need to wait to understand President Trump's position and his administration's position. But as you point out, we have gone through recently a round of bipartisan funding in the United States that was passed, significant multi-year funding for Ukraine, and we should take confidence from that. It is in nobody's interest for Russia to succeed in this war. We must stand with Ukraine, and I have personal confidence that the United States will see that through. And it's for this government, this Defence Secretary and Prime Minister, as I say, to work with President-elect Trump to that end.
Should the government stick to its principles or be nimble and adapt, given the changing shape of the US political spectrum?
You have to deal with whoever is in office. We should celebrate the fact that the United States has elected President-elect Trump with a strong mandate. And this is a success for democracy. No matter who would have won, we have to work with them. And it's right that whoever's in office in our country has a good relationship, and we in the official opposition need to support them as best we can. It is in a difficult context, of course, with previous comments that have been made by our chief diplomat, but I'll leave that to you and other journalists to question the Labour Party on.
Which we have done extensively in the past week or so already. Peter Mandelson, would he be a good choice for ambassador?
Well, that is a matter for the Prime Minister, but what I would want in an ambassador to the United States is somebody who stands up for British interests when it comes to trade, ensuring that we do have free trade with our strongest ally, but a key export partner. and that we have a very strong military relationship, and that we show commitment and certainty when it comes to, for example, military spending to 2.5%.
Nigel Farage is clearly a friend, personal friend of Donald Trump's, and has offered his services to the government, whether it's specifically as ambassador or some kind of advisor. Would the Conservatives had embraced that offer or not?
I think our links to the United States, to the Republican Party and to President-elect Trump's new administration would be strong enough that we don't require the services of Nigel Farage. But
you wouldn't want to remove him as a thorn to your side in Parliament?
As I said, I think we have a long-standing record in government and relationships with our friends and allies across the pond, and we don't require those services, I don't think.
What do you hope to come out of the COP summit?
Well, look, first of all, let's step back and just recognise that the UK has been leading the world for many years when it comes to decarbonising our economy. We were one of the first countries to set a legal target, and since then we have decarbonised faster than any country around the world. And so a lot of countries do look to us. But we also said, just as we came to the end of our time in office, that we need to bring the people with us and that we need to ensure that families and small businesses in particular are not burdened with the cost of net zero, and we therefore need pragmatic solutions. And so what I would hope is that we see other countries playing a big role. We are at just 1% of global emissions in the UK, and so it's not right that we lead the world to the extent that nobody else follows. It's very important that other countries do their bit to reduce emissions, and that's what I would hope that this government press on other countries and our friends and allies.
With that in mind, and with the prospect of the US withdrawing from it once again, should we go our own way, do what's right for our country, for the environment too, but not be bound by some of these collective agreements like COP?
As I say, I think it's important when we have these agreements that they are pragmatic and they don't harm the most vulnerable in our country, and that we bring people with us in this endeavour. It is vital that we engage with the United States and other countries to ensure that they are meeting the work that we're doing to bring down emissions, which ultimately is a national security issue for all countries around the world.
Finally, before we go, Shadow Minister, why do you think Kemi Badenoch won the Conservative leadership?
I think we had two excellent candidates at the end who put forward a vision for the future of the party. They didn't have that dissimilar views in terms of, ensuring that we reflect the values of the British people. Smaller state, lower taxes, ensure that we have a strong military. I think Kemi put forward a very good campaign that won clearly and decisively among our membership, and we now all are part of her team as we go forward to the next election to beat this Labour government, who are breaking promises all over the place.
Gareth Davis, thanks so much for joining us. Good to see you. Still to come here on The Breakfast Show, a busy day for the Prime Minister, travelling to Paris, then to Baku. We'll be speaking to Jack and Sam about the political day and week ahead, plus the latest from the MTV European Music Awards in Manchester, where tributes have been paid to the One Direction singer Liam Payne. We'll be right back.
We've come to one of Moscow's Cold War bunkers. It was built as a top-secret command centre. Being here really feels like you're stepping back in time. I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent. A show of military might and menace. Courage, bravery and sacrifice will win the day. It's a new subject. They'll learn about combat drones and some how to handle a Kalashnikov. The Kremlin continues to put forward its own version of events, both present and past. There's no mention of the fact that Russia invaded its neighbour. That's rewriting history, isn't it?
Now we have to read it carefully.
Vladimir Putin put forward his plan for a ceasefire in Ukraine, telling Kiev, pull out of your eastern territories and the war will end. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Vladimir Putin is already the Kremlin's longest-serving leader since Stalin. The question is, what will a fifth Putin term mean for Russia and the world? Why do you support Vladimir Putin, Mr. Segal?
I can't answer questions that stupid.
I've watched Vladimir Putin attempt to create a new world order. The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was the backdrop to Vladimir Putin's latest verbal volley that Russia could send missiles to other nations to target the West. Ambassador, I wonder, shall we have a quick word from Sky News? Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine?
Swedish media, oh my God, you're not afraid of being here.
American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, but was first on display. Russia says Evan Gershkovich was caught red-handed, but has never produced any evidence to back that up. Sky News. Get the full story first.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
This conflict. They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people. That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
Welcome back to The Breakfast Show. Well, coming up, Jack and Sam are here to set up the week ahead in politics. But first, a reminder of all day's top stories. Leah's got those for us.
Thanks, Wilfred. In Ukraine, at least 6 people have reportedly been killed in overnight strikes by Russia. Ukraine's Air Force says it shot down several other missiles and drones overnight. The United Nations meeting on climate change, known as COP29, begins in Baku today. The summit has been largely overshadowed by the re-election of Donald Trump, who calls oil liquid gold. And the Israeli government has told its citizens not to attend cultural or sporting events abroad over the next week, including here in the UK, following recent violence in Amsterdam.
Yeah, thank you. A busy day ahead for the Prime Minister. He's in France for Remembrance Day commemorations, Armistice Day commemorations this morning, before heading then to Baku for the COP29 summit. Well, Politico's UK editor Jack Blanchard says the Prime Minister has an important role on the world stage when it comes to shaping the climate agenda.
Keir Starmer sort of stands alone now, Sam, as this sort of great hope of centre-left politics around the world and would be expected to show leadership on the climate agenda because he's one of the few leaders from that sort of way of thinking who's actually got political capital at home. It might not feel like it sometimes when we're talking about it, but don't forget, obviously, he won that massive majority only a few months ago and is actually in a very strong political position compared to many of his fellow leaders. And so, yeah, he will take it upon himself to try and show some leadership on this. But of course, the problem, obviously, barely needs saying, the problem with the climate change is that you need to do these things cooperatively, and there's only so much Britain could ever do on its own.
Well, Jack's here with me on set, and we're joined by Sam, our deputy political editor, as well, who's down the line. Often down the line now, Jack. Does that mean we don't have to speak to him?
We can speak to him as much as we want to. Unfortunately, Sam's role is a roving one, and he gets dispatched around the world.
The reason, and we do need to listen to what he's got to say because he's, of course, on the beat and ahead a very busy day, Sam, for the PM.
That's right. I am sort of by a runway. I'm about to hop on the Prime Minister's plane. He is heading to Paris. He's already in Paris having breakfast with Michel Barnier. We're going to pick him up in Paris and then head on to Azerbaijan, a country I've been to before, to Baku, where COP29, the Climate Change Summit, is underway. Keir Starmer has been abroad a lot recently. With this summit, the previous one, next week's one, I think he's been away 22 days of the 71 since September the 1st. He likes and thinks it is important to press the flesh with foreign leaders in the face of massive, intractable problems that have all got worse since the election of Donald Trump last week.
Sam, we are looking at live pictures at the moment of Sir Keir Starmer being welcomed by President Macron outside the Elysee Palace. And Jack, it is fascinating to see the warmth between them and with in mind what we know both of them represent and centre-left in light of what is happening, not just in the US, but in Germany potentially too as well.
Yeah, the European leaders will suddenly feel like they've got their backs against the wall now, given what happened in America last week. And I think the summit that's about to happen right now between Macron and Keir Starmer, it's pretty clear what's going to be top of their agenda. You know, they've paid their respects to the fallen this morning, but now they need to get down to business, and they're going to be talking about one man, Donald Trump, and what he means for European relations, European security, European trade, climate change as well, of course. All these things, suddenly American foreign policy is up in the air and is looking like it's going to change dramatically. And as you mentioned, Germany, we're expecting now a snap election in Germany pretty soon, and it's pretty clear that Olaf Scholz, the centre-left leader of Germany, is on his way out. So, you know, they are watching their sort of allies dropping like flies at the moment, people like Keir Starmer, and it's a lonely place on the world stage for a centre-left leader these days.
And Sam, I mean, take us inside the room in terms of the mood that will be there between the two men. I mean, Keir Starmer has a fresher, more recent mandate, of course, than President Macron has, and in that sense will be feeling comfortable in his position and in his skin. But there's a lot of pressure around them, and the US top of mind, despite a resolute set of responses this morning from the Defence Secretary to us about the safety of Ukraine. They can't be as sure about all of that, can they, privately as they are publicly?
Look, it's very, very difficult. It's easy, in some senses, for President Macron and Keir Starmer to smile for the cameras. But when it comes even to forging joint positions on some of the big economic issues, on trade, on whether or not the EU and the UK are going to cooperate on trying to face down and fight those tariffs, or whether or not they might end up competing against each other and using each other in order to avoid those tariffs, it isn't quite clear. I think there's much more agreement on the issue of Ukraine. There is a determination inside the British government to see what can be done before President Trump takes over on January the 20th. Is there a way of persuading President Biden to throw more money at Ukraine, spend more on arms, maybe loosen the rules on what weapons can be used and in what way? But I have to say, Wilf, even if the international community has some will and resolve to try and change the game vis-a-vis Putin and Ukraine in the next 9 weeks or so, I've watched many outgoing US presidents really try and struggle and ultimately fail to change global affairs in the final few weeks of their presidency. So I suspect putting too much reliance on what President Biden can do between now and January the 20th is perhaps not the answer. But then there's the question of the extent to which Britain wants to cooperate with the EU on things like defence. Of course, Keir Starmer repeatedly saying he wants a security pact with the US. There was a version of that Boris Johnson negotiated. But what specifically does that mean? And will Europe, which is so divided and so fractured, and so many different leaders now heading to general elections, will they be able to come to a common position on what they want to do with the UK as well? All of these things feel very, very tricky.
So, Sam, it's a bilat with Macron now, and then the Armistice days, of course, commemorations from 11 o'clock. Then he's on to Baku for COP. Does he want to go to Baku? Is he passionate about this? Is this something he really cares about? Or is it a distraction? Because the turnout of world leaders is perhaps not as good as it could have been.
Look, I think there's a strong political and policy argument that he would make as to why he's there. He campaigned as somebody who's passionate about climate change. And also, there is just the argument that he will advance that if you invest in green technology now, then in the future you'll be able to mean that you're less exposed to fossil fuels and the price variation and fluctuation of that. And that's the best way to fight inflation in the medium to long term and keep consumer bills down. But there is another argument that I suspect the Tories will leap on top of and has been given fresh impetus by the election of Donald Trump, that gas prices and the increase in gas production, which likely happens in the US, is also a way of buying cheaper energy. Take this one thing, Wilf, which I think is fascinating. Back in February, the EU were committing huge amounts of sums to sort of decarbonisation and weaning themselves off gas. Yet in the last 48 hours, one of the questions being asked in some EU capitals is, well, in order to avoid tariffs, do we actually offer to buy some US gas? In other words, re-hitching themselves to fossil fuels from the US in order to satisfy economic goals. That gives you just a little sense of just how complicated Donald Trump's election has made even things like climate change. Now, Keir Starmer, you're right, will be a tall poppy at this summit because Scholz and Macron and Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, and Biden won't be there. He will hope that allows him to show leadership. But also, as Jack was saying, you need cooperation to do climate change, and people aren't sure what direction they need to go in.
Jack, do you think his presence there is a sign of unrelenting commitment to Labour's pre-election goals on net zero and clean energy?
Oh, I think he had to go. I mean, he would have taken so much stick from inside the Labour Party if you get elected as Prime Minister and then a few months later you don't go to the world's biggest climate change summit, especially after Labour and Starmer scaled back some of the green investment they had planned. And you might also remember, Wilf, we were chatting about this on the podcast, back in 2022, just after Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, he said he wasn't going to go to the COP climate change summit. He was too busy, he had too much stuff to get on with at home, and the wealth of amount of criticism he got from the Labour Party, then in opposition, meant that 48 hours later he U-turned and went to the summit. So it would have been pretty hypocritical for Keir Starmer not to do the same thing himself. One
of the other things, Jack, that's come up on the podcast, and always love tuning in to both of you, is this debate. I guess we're all guessing game a little bit about who might be ambassador to the US, but linked to that, have the government put to bed the questions about the Foreign Secretary's future?
There are still lots of questions about the sort of the people that the Labour government put in the front line to deal with this new incoming Trump administration. They're going to be absolutely pivotal figures for Britain over the next 4 years, given we know the nature of the next president is so combustious, so different, and all the diplomatic norms go out of the window. You're right, there's intense speculation about who's going to be made Britain's new ambassador over in Washington. Peter Mandelson, we'll all remember him, the Dark Lord of the new Labour years, is one of the names in the mix. And there are still questions about the future of David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and it's striking, but mainly because of the comments he made in the past were so strong about Donald Trump back when David Lammy was a backbench MP. They are circulating in America now as well. It's very striking to see Karen Pierce, the current British ambassador in Washington, was on telly in America yesterday, straight away getting asked about this by American TV presenters. Look at what your Foreign Secretary said about our next president. How can he still do the job?
And Jack, comment for me on this sort of return, if it is Mandelson, alongside the Jonathan Powell appointment of the sort of Blairite era of advice. Is that all coincidence?
Certainly not coincidence. I mean, we still don't know whether it will be Mandelson. There are other names in the mix as well, but it's pretty clear that Keir Starmer has a lot of respect for that new Labour operation of the noughties. He's listened to Peter Mandelson's advice on lots of things. As you say, he's now appointed Tony Blair's old Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, to one of the most important advisory positions in Downing Street. There's no doubt that Starmer respects not only Blair's ability to win elections, but also the professionalism of that government and that operation.
Sam, last word to you in terms of what's the Prime Minister like on these big foreign trips? Does he thrive on the world stage?
He's somebody who inhabits that skin very, very easily, I think. I think of him a little bit like David Cameron, actually. He has taken to global politics very naturally. He looks comfortable with other world leaders. I think my question is, does he like going abroad and escaping the kind of the tumult at home just a little bit too much? There have been, as I was saying at the start, a lot of days where he's been out of the country. And while Jack's completely right, you couldn't really dodge COP. I think that the 5-day trip to Samoa, where Downing Street sort of lost control of the agenda a bit, was an example of where the week before the budget there have been some grumblings in Whitehall that he enjoys himself a little bit too much. So no doubt there'll be a smiling Prime Minister coming to the back of the plane to brief us in a few hours' time. But he's off again next week to Brazil. So he really does enjoy the foreign travel aspect of this.
Well, Sam, I hope you'll enjoy yourself too, but most importantly, bring us the key headlines from the trip, and we look forward to your coverage. And we continue to enjoy politics at Jack and Sam's every single day. I presume, Jack, there'll still be an episode while Sam's travelling?
There will, yeah. I'll be up at the crack of dawn. I think it's a bit later in the day in Baku, but Sam will be transmitting in from Azerbaijan, rather him than me.
Having enjoyed in 1 hour or two Lion as well. Lucky Sam. Well worth subscribing if you haven't done so already. Scan that QR code on the screen right now. Politics at Jack and Sam's, Monday to Thursdays, a key early morning start to get all of the news from Westminster and Baku. Now, the music industry has remembered One Direction singer Liam Payne as stars gathered for the MTV Europe Music Awards in Manchester. Rita Ora, who was presenting the show for a third time, was tearful as she paid tribute to him. Our arts and entertainment correspondent Katie Spencer was there.
A poignant moment at the MTV EMAs. In One Direction, Liam Payne won countless awards at this annual music celebration. Almost a month on from his death in Argentina, many who knew him well, like host Rita Ora, stopped to remember.
Liam Payne was one of the kindest people that I knew.
This the first big gathering of music's great and good since the industry lost one of its own. Even Jedward, who came through X Factor like Payne did, struggling to maintain their usual lightness.
And we came from the same TV show, so it's the fact that we've all kind of been in the same race. A lot of artists are going through a personal struggle. A lot of musicians, they don't realise that it's not all glitz and glam. You have your highs, your lows, but you have to be content with your success. And like, we're never the hottest thing, we're never like the most whatever, but we always turn up for ourselves.
This is my song called Body Dysmorphia. It's a song about hating the way that you look. And it goes like this. I let my fingers pinch my skin. I'm so hungry, I can't sleep.
A seductive power to fame, but this level of attention, this life, by no means an easy one. Ray singing about the pressures of maintaining a certain body image.
As the party comes to Manchester, while the flashbulbs are pointed at the stars, here, what happens off stage within the music industry is coming under focus like never before.
Including the wisdom of mixing pop and politics after many stars endorsed Kamala Harris in the US election race.
No, I think everyone has to do what's right for them, you know what I mean? We're all like human beings at the end of the day. So I feel like as long as you kind of speak for what you believe in, then what else can you do?
Focus here tonight on performances as well as the prizes. But with so much to grapple with, it's not exactly a winning time for the wider music industry. Katie Spencer, Sky News in Manchester.
Also to come here on The Breakfast Show, we'll be joined by a guest from the UN's climate conference to discuss those deadly floods in Spain.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. Alex Crawford joining us now from Ukraine.
Their personal possessions are all scattered around the place.
Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, try and make sense of the big numbers for us.
Things can change incredibly quickly, and that's what they have done.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests.
Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news. The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Trust in politics is at an all-time low. What's going wrong and can we fix it? It's from Liz. She wants to know, why is there still no sign of the Labour Party electing a woman as leader?
It's sort of embarrassing. You know, it takes a very strong man to be leader, but it takes an even stronger man to support a woman for leader.
If you want to be mean to politicians, like, crack on. The activists that go out and make elections happen, I kind of feel like just don't be horrible to them. Be polite to them in the same way that they're polite to you.
Keir Starmer has got us into government with a big majority. He was completely clear before the election that he wasn't going to be able to do the two-child benefit policy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't an early thing that comes along.
I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello? No, yes, where is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking land. Let me see it. This is brilliant.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world, the likes of Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Sir Elton John. We try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's futures.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Welcome back. The UN's climate summit gets underway today. The importance of the summit highlighted by the recent deadly floods in Spain. Well, over the weekend in Valencia, around 100,000 people protested against the authorities' handling of the disaster. Joining us now from Baku is Carmen Marquez Ruiz, who's an EU Climate Pact ambassador from Valencia. Thanks so much for joining us, Carmen. Just sum up for us at the moment that strength of feeling in Spain about the devastation created by those floods.
Good morning. Yeah, I would like to say that in Valencia, in Spain in general, we have a very strong feeling of sadness, of anger, of frustration, and at the same time also of hope and pride for all the immense work of that all these volunteers have made in the past, and that are very needed to help the affected people to get on with their lives, to go back to a reasonable life. But I would say that in Spain, the main feeling is sadness, sorrow, and anger.
As you said, those are understandably the main feelings in this tragic immediate aftermath. Do you think one of the effects, though, in the months and years ahead will be to change the scale of public commitment to climate change?
I would say that is very, very much needed, and I hope that it will happen. We need to have policies that really protect our citizens, and this can be done making changes in the way we organize our economic life, our social life. We have to reduce emissions. We have to go ahead with decarbonizing our economy. We have also to take measures to adapt to the climate change, because as we have seen in Valencia, in Spain, climate change is here and it's here to stay. And we need to take these facts into account. It's not an opinion, it's a reality. And then also we have to improve the way we organize ourselves, because unfortunately the tragedy that has happened in Valencia is not going to be the last one. Unfortunately, we will have more and more frequent extreme weather events. Until now, we thought this could happen only in a distant Pacific island or in the Caribbean. But the fact is that the Mediterranean is becoming our Caribbean. So we have to get better organized. We have to act as a united group. We cannot use the tragedy to attack each other. We are in a situation where we have to make a collective effort to save our societies and our citizens. And public policies have to be changed and improved in order to take this new factor into account.
Hey, Carmen, morning to you. The key negotiating issue at COP29 is financing climate action in developing countries. Given what we're seeing that's happening in Valencia, is that the right priority, do you think?
Well, the problem is that there are so many important priorities going on, but we have to understand one thing, is that the amount of damage that Valencia has suffered is huge. So if we think of this in global terms, the quantities are in terms of trillions. And of course, we are in a situation where solidarity is not always the highest in the public arena. Although we can see that in the way citizens have reacted, it is still quite very important and very strong. But we have to stop thinking about this climate finance as a charity, with a charity approach. In fact, we have to think of this increase of climate finance as an intelligent way of protecting ourselves. If we don't do it together, we will not manage. We will not we will not win climate change. We have to be aware that we are all sharing the same planet, and that our acts, and as emitters of greenhouse emissions, have an impact not only in our local communities but all over the world. And this means that policies have to take this factor into account. Climate change is a global challenge. That's why we are here, to make sure that we get an agreement on climate finance and other things. But it has a local impact, as we have seen in Valencia. We have to act at both levels and make sure that we are coherent with these facts.
We have just less than a minute left. What is the reaction to the US presidential election there at COP in Baku?
Well, until now we heard only the opening of it. We had the opening ceremony that was, that where the previous president of COP28 and the COP29, and also the executive secretary of the UNFCCC made hopeful speeches about the need to act. But of course, the result of the elections in the United States are around us, and it's true that this COP starts with in a very difficult political context, because the fact is that the United States is the second global emitter, and if we have in the U.S. presidency a climate denier, this is going to affect the policies of the United States, and this is not going to affect American citizens, but all the citizens in the world. It's a pity that only Americans can vote in the U.S. elections, but the fact is that the U.S. president has an impact in the life of many citizens around the world. So I would say that it is not the time to let it go. We have to accept that it's a democratic result, but we have to make sure that this doesn't hamper the climate talks in a way that it would discourage us and would prevent us from reaching an agreement.
Forgive me for interrupting. It was a pleasure talking to you today. Thanks for joining us. After this short break, we'll have much more live coverage of Armistice Day.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Good morning, it's 9 o'clock on today's show. Russia attacks Ukraine overnight. How will the West and President-elect Trump respond?
We're live in Paris, where the Prime Minister is joining the French President to mark Armistice Day.
And we hear tributes to Liam Payne after some of music's biggest stars came together in Manchester.
It's Monday, the 11th of November. Your headlines. At least 6 people are killed and 21 more injured as Russia strikes Ukraine. We asked the Defence Secretary if US support will survive a second Trump presidency.
I expect the US to remain alongside allies like the UK, standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes to prevail over Putin's invasion.
Keir Starmer's in Paris for Armistice Day, the first Prime Minister to do so since Sir Winston Churchill. Climate finance, top of the agenda at COP as developing nations demand support for decarbonising their rapidly growing economies. Plus,
following the budget, I actually think I've been indirectly taxed.
Sky News returns to its election target town of Grimsby, where voters are less than impressed by the Prime Minister's first few months in office. A very good morning to you. We start in Ukraine, where at least 6 people have reportedly been killed in overnight strikes by Russia. 21 more people were injured and blackouts were imposed in parts of the country as a safety measure. Regional governors say that 5 of those killed died in the Mykolaiv region, while another person died in the Zaporizhzhia region. It comes amid growing concerns over a Donald Trump presidency and United States support for Kiev. Well, this morning, the Defence Secretary told me he expected that support from the US would remain in place.
No, I don't. The US, alongside the UK, have been 2 of the leading countries that have been standing by Ukraine, supporting Ukraine. Our determination to do so is just as strong. And I was at a NATO defence ministers just 2 weeks ago when all NATO nations recommitted to stepping up support for Ukraine at this time when they're under pressure, but Russia is weakening.
But does really the only countries within NATO's support that makes a big difference remain the US's support?
It's certainly the case that the US has been the outstanding supporter of Ukraine. And that's because on a bipartisan basis in the US, they recognise the importance of stopping big countries redrawing international boundaries by force and allowing aggressors like Putin to launch illegal invasions. And as far as President Trump goes, he recognises that countries get security through strength, just as alliances like NATO do. And I expect the US to remain alongside allies like the UK, standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes to prevail over Putin's invasion.
Well, our correspondent Ivor Bennett joins us now from Moscow. Ivor, is that the Russian interpretation of what the Trump presidency will mean for support for Ukraine?
Well, look, the Russian interpretation of the Trump presidency is very hard to know. They are keeping their cards very close to their chest, and we got a reflection of that in the last few moments with an update from the Kremlin on these reports, or a reaction to these reports of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump having a call last week. They said that this is completely false. This came from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin's chief spokesman. He said there was no conversation, and he reiterated the line we got last week was that there are no specific plans for Vladimir Putin to speak to Trump at the present. So denying these reports overnight from the Washington Post and the Reuters news agency that the two did share a call last week. On Thursday, we were told, the day after the election results, we're told that the two discussed Ukraine and that Donald Trump reportedly urged Vladimir Putin not to escalate the conflict there, and he reminded Putin, we're told, of America's sizable military presence in Ukraine. Now, will that ease concerns in Kiev? Well, maybe a little bit, but because it's not the pro-Russian rhetoric, if it's true, that they were expecting to hear. But at the same time, if it's true, it is contact between the two. It is the first contact on the phone since this election. I think that will fuel anxiety levels, these reports, about how this relationship between Putin and Trump will develop, because they did get on well last time, of course, remember. And Vladimir Putin seems to want to rekindle that relationship, given his comments last week. He congratulated Trump on his election win. He praised his bravery during his assassination attempt over the summer, calling him a real man. And I think there are fears, of course, that they will get along well again. I think the UK is also fearful of that, despite John Healey's remarks this morning. And I think his remarks are a case of the UK wanting to put a brave face on things, and they reflect two things, I think. One is that we simply don't know what Donald Trump's policy is actually going to be on Ukraine. Yes, he has indicated repeatedly that he is going to cut military aid. He's vowed to bring the conflict there to a rapid end and to bring about a peace deal, but he hasn't said how that's going to happen, and he hasn't said what peace will look like. So for now, I think the UK is hedging its bets. And secondly, I think the UK is being realistic here. It knows that Donald Trump is going to be in the White House in the next 4 years, so they have to get on with him. So there's no point launching verbal attacks now before he's come into office. And I think they're trying now to launch a bit of a charm offensive, trying to persuade him to see their point of view, not to abandon Ukraine. The trouble is, it seems that Russia is also trying to launch a charm offensive.
Ivor, as always, thanks so much. Ivor Bennett for us live in Moscow this morning. Well, today, of course, is Armistice Day, a remembrance of the agreement to end the First World War on the 11th of November 1918. Well, earlier, the Defence Secretary, John Healey, told me commemorations should be used to raise awareness among younger people about the sacrifices made by our armed forces.
And so I think we need to do more and use remembrance and armistice, not just to recognise the sacrifices of those who gave so much, but also to remind ourselves that peace and freedoms are hard won, must always be defended, and to encourage the new generations to understand better. And I must say, I'm really encouraged. Compared to 10 years ago, I go into schools in my constituency in South Yorkshire, and many more are doing projects, many more are doing pieces of work that help them understand the role of the armed forces today and the sacrifice of those in the past.
Well, Sky's royal correspondent Laura Bundock joins us now from the Cenotaph, where, of course, there were various commemorations yesterday, and they're ongoing today.
That's right. The King led the nation in the act of remembrance here yesterday. And today, on Armistice Day, there will be another event here. It is, of course, the 11th of the 11th. And at 11 o'clock, there will be a 2-minute silence to mark the moment the guns fell silent across the Western Front. And to tell us a little bit more about what's happening here today is the Honorary Vice President of the Western Front Association, Major General Mungo Melvin. A very good morning to you.
Good morning.
It is 110 years ago since the start of the First World War. Why is today still important?
Well, although it's a very long time ago, I think it's still very important for us as a nation and for our allies to remember the events of the First World War, to learn from those events, and above all, to honour the great sacrifice that the people of Britain and the soldiers at the front gave their lives, not just for king and country, but for our way of life. And we owe our peace today to that sacrifice in both world wars.
Tell us a little bit about what will be taking place here a little later on.
Well, this ceremony today on Armistice Day grew from a very small event. It was re-inaugurated in 1994, so today is the 30th anniversary of the Western Front Association's parade here. And it's an opportunity for not only Western Front members to come, but also other groups, children's groups, cadets, and indeed, across the road, the Ministry of Defence will come out, I think, as I did 20 years ago, to honour this day. So it's a collective event, not just the WFA, and it's an opportunity to remind everybody, as you said, when the guns went silent at 11 o'clock on the 11th, we should remember that and honour that.
And for you personally, what does this day mean?
Well, as a soldier, and I served for 37 years in the regular army and then another 7 years in the reserve, so obviously took part in many of these ceremonies, indeed including those on operations. And I think it's an opportunity for us, and perhaps if I may quote those immortal words from Kohima, on the memorial to the fallen, when you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today.
They're moving words, aren't they? And the importance of bringing in schools from right across the country, how important is that?
It's very important, and I think one of the great successes of the commemorations, the centenary commemorations, was bringing the schools in, and the army and others, including me, did a big effort in trying to help educate people, train people to take school parties out to the Western Front. And I know that from my own children and grandchildren, this memory is something to be preserved, and therefore I welcome the new generation learning about the First World War.
Is it harder to preserve that memory? I mean, there are those of us who will remember the First World War veterans taking part in commemorations here, but there are many, many people now who don't have that memory.
Well, and now we've only got precious few of the Second World War veterans, and I think it means it's doubly important that we as a nation, across all communities, can remember the previous sacrifices and understand why people went to war to preserve peace.
Major General Mungo Melvin, thank you very much indeed. Well, at 11 o'clock today, here and right across the country, events will be held to mark the moment, a minute's silence and a moment really to stop, to think and to remember.
Laura, thanks so much for that. And of course, we'll have live coverage building up to all of those Armistice Days celebrations. And Mari, the Prime Minister's not going to be here in London. He was yesterday, of course, because he's in Paris for commemorations there. And before the 2 minute silence coming later, he's having a bilat as we speak with President Macron.
Yeah, I think it's underway literally as we speak. So we had those images just earlier on live on Sky News of Keir Starmer and Macron greeting each other, looking quite chirpy, quite warm, quite, you know, there you go, quite a nice little pat on the back there. Yeah, so quite a warm meeting there. And they're having this bilateral meeting where they are going to talk about the commemorations for Armistice Day, of course, but also they are going to talk about foreign policy, specifically around the humanitarian situation we continue to see on our screens in Gaza, about the war between Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and inevitably about the impact of the Donald Trump victory on not just the Middle East and Ukraine, but also on the UK economy when it comes to those threats, that rhetoric around tariffs and the possibility of 10-20% tariffs on European countries and on countries specifically like the UK and France. So realistically, I think we'll be also expecting them to speak about that and finding ways to mitigate some of that impact from the US. Now, we don't know what President Trump is going to do, of course, but we do know from government telling us that, you know, they are preparing for different scenarios in case tariffs are slapped on the UK, for instance. So it'll be an interesting conversation, I think, between the two world leaders. And then after those commemorations, the PM will then fly to Baku in Azerbaijan for COP29, which is something we don't hear as much about compared to COP26, for instance.
Yeah,
which is quite interesting.
It's of course, on the agenda, but something that he's travelling to. Mari, great stuff. Thank you very much. And Leah, COP kicked off earlier today.
Yeah, it did in Azerbaijan. Nations meeting to discuss climate change, of course. And the event has been overshadowed somewhat by the re-election of Donald Trump, who calls oil liquid gold. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, has this report.
The climate talks begin in Baku today under a cloud. America's next president is promising to pull out of the process. Key EU leaders have cancelled attendance, dealing with the political crisis at home. For a negotiation already lagging well behind the pace of our changing climate, is it a fatal blow? Not so, says the man running it.
This year, we had more than 60 countries, elections in more than 60 countries. More than 4 billion people voted. There have been a lot of change, including within the European Union, within other countries. The political landscape has changed, but it has not affected the negotiation process.
If he's right, central to the talks is a deal on climate finance. And host country Azerbaijan is an example of why. Oil and gas beneath Baku and the Caspian Sea beyond make up 90% of its export revenue. The summit wants to see money from countries who've already grown rich by burning fossil fuels to pay for others to transition away from them. Like this. The Garadar solar farm, 15 miles south of Baku, is a vision of a clean energy future for even an oil-rich state like this.
Azerbaijan is committed to increase its renewable generation by 30% by 2030. And by quadrupling solar electricity production by building far more big solar farms like this one. It's taking big steps in that direction, but it's also taking bigger steps the opposite way, with plans to increase its oil and gas production by 30% within a decade.
So is Azerbaijan, like many other countries at these talks, really committed to a greener future? A cynic would point to Baku's cultural centre, built with $250 million of oil wealth, newly fitted out with electric car chargers. Hasty preparation to clean up the city's image ahead of the climate roadshow.
Is Azerbaijan guilty of greenwashing?
If you would ask me that question 2 years ago, I would say greenwashing. But now there is an economical rationale behind it. Reducing local consumption, maintaining export capacity.
One of the reasons Azerbaijan is increasing its fossil fuel production is to meet the demands of Europe, desperate since the war in Ukraine for alternatives to Russian supplies. The same Europe pressuring the world at these talks to reduce emissions faster. The kind of contradiction that explains why progress is so slow and success so far from guaranteed. Tom Clark, Sky News, Baku.
The Israeli government has told its citizens not to attend cultural or sporting events abroad over the next week following recent violence in Amsterdam. The office of Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, claims it has intelligence that pro-Palestinian groups intended to harm Israelis in foreign cities, including in the UK. Well, the Home Office told Sky News there's no place for anti-Semitism on our streets and we will not allow cultural and sporting events to be hijacked by those who seek to promote hate. They go on to say those who push this poison offline and online will face the full force of the law. Police and the security services continue to work to ensure the safety of every community in this country. One person has died and 16 others have been injured in a shooting at a university in Alabama. The attack happened on the last day of homecoming week at Tuskegee University. Authorities say a 25-year-old man has been arrested and charged with a federal offence. It's been a difficult start for the Labour government with a budget that wasn't exactly as advertised in the run-up to the election. The party's plans to rebuild Britain without raising taxes was a point of contention between Sir Keir Starmer and the audience at our election leaders event back in June. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, has travelled back to Grimsby, one of our target towns, to see what voters there make of the PM's performance so far.
Grimsby and Cleethorpes on the Humber Estuary, home to Sky News' election target towns and one of the seats that helped tip the balance for Starmer on the 5th of July. Welcome to Grimsby Town Hall, where we're joined tonight by the two men vying for the keys to Downing Street. Sharon, hi. It's so nice to see you again. Thank you for coming along. So we're back to catch up with some of the voters who put their questions at the Sky News Leaders event. Sharon, Cayman and Amy. A few months in, Keir Starmer's first budget's finally given the contours of Labour's plans, and it's not exactly as advertised before people went to the polls.
No tax rises in the next Parliament.
No tax rises needed in the plans in our manifesto.
In the plans.
No tax rises for working people.
Lifelong Labour voter Sharon wanted to know if Starmer really wouldn't put up taxes in order to invest.
How it's all going to be funded? If taxes are not going up, how are you going to fund it?
We need to put money and resource into Grimsby. We need resource decision-making to come.
That was the question, Sharon, wasn't it? How are you going to fund it?
Yeah, absolutely. And following the budget, I actually think I've been indirectly taxed.
I couldn't bring myself to vote for Keir because I was worried that things like this may happen. You know, he wants to bring the growth into the country. How have we done that? By, putting the burden on businesses to grow.
For Cayman, a question foreshadowing the concerns that have plagued the early days of Starmer's premiership.
You seem more like a political robot. Well, for most of...
Has he loosened up a bit since Cayman?
I feel like he's still a robot, yeah.
Still robotic.
Still robotic, yeah.
The jury's still very much out on this new government after a budget that came as a surprise to voters and to the Labour MP who won this seat for Starmer. In the days after the budget, taxes going up for small businesses in Grimsby, were you surprised by it?
I was, which I've been told not to keep saying.
It's been a difficult start for Starmer, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think you'd be, a bit blind to say that you hadn't seen a bit of a rocky start.
A political landslide that stands on shaky ground. Starmer gambling that his big budget will pay off and persuade voters about him and his government. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Great Grimsby.
A longer version of Beth's package is available on the Sky News website. Well, lots more to come here on the breakfast show, of course, including the build-up to the Armistice Day's commemorations, remembering those who made the ultimate sacrifice. We'll be discussing all of that with our events commentator, Alistair Bruce, next.
We've come to one of Moscow's Cold War bunkers. It was built as a top-secret command centre.
Being here really feels like you're stepping back in time. I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent.
A show of military might and menace.
Courage, bravery and sacrifice will win the day.
It's a new subject. They'll learn about combat drones and some how to handle a Kalashnikov.
The Kremlin continues to put forward its own version of events, both present and past.
There's no mention of the fact that Russia invaded its neighbour. That's rewriting history, isn't it?
Now we have to read it carefully.
Vladimir Putin put forward his plan for a ceasefire in Ukraine, telling Kiev, pull out of your eastern territories and the war will end. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Vladimir Putin is already the Kremlin's longest-serving leader since Stalin. The question is, what will a fifth Putin term mean for Russia and the world? Why do you support Vladimir Putin, Mr. Segal?
I can't answer questions that stupid.
I've watched Vladimir Putin attempt to create a new world order.
The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was the backdrop to Vladimir Putin's latest verbal volley that Russia could send missiles to other nations to target the West.
Ambassador, I wonder, shall we have a quick word for Sky News?
Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine?
Swedish media, oh my God, you're not afraid of being here.
American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, but was first on display.
Russia says Evan Gershkovich was caught red-handed, but has never produced any evidence to back that up. Sky News. Get the full story first.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
This conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America? People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News. The full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
Welcome back to the breakfast show. Well, we are going to be talking now about Armistice Day, which of course we'll have live throughout the morning here on Sky News. And Alistair Bruce, our events commentator, is with us to discuss the significance. And Alistair, just remind our viewers what exactly is being remembered today.
The Great War was the first worldwide conflagration of weaponry and death. And that war came to an end at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month. But it came to an end because there had been a signature made early that morning in a railway carriage in the middle of a forest in France. And we remember that huge moment because it ended what was for every village, town and city in the United Kingdom and around its empire, and most of the world, one which had been calling for so many young lives to feed the engines of death of war. And there was such relief after Armistice that it marked a complete change in people's attitudes and their lives. And people start to build after Armistice for a world that would have no more war. Now, we know the Armistice led probably to the Second World War, but the bottom line is that for everybody on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, it was the end of this awful war.
Who was there in that railway carriage?
Principally Marshal Foch, who was representing the Entente or Allied powers. And with him was the First Sea Lord, Admiral Weems. And then the German contingent came. They were really representing a nation in turmoil. The Kaiser of Germany, who was their emperor, had recently abdicated. There was mayhem on the streets of Germany. People had had enough of the war. And so they were representing an effectively defeated nation, although the army of Germany never felt it had been defeated. But they therefore signed in order to end this horrific war, and it was just key for the future of peace.
We're looking at some live pictures here, Alistair, of Ypres. We've, of course, got the live picture of the cenotaph here in London as well. The Prime Minister, though, will be in Paris this morning, of course, having led commemorations alongside the King here yesterday. Quite a striking decision by the Prime Minister to be in Paris, or kind of understandable?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity for the Prime Minister, clearly politically, to get time with the President of France, but with very good reason, because of the fact that it was the French and British who were in that railway carriage on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. And here we have the heads of government of both nations many years on. And I think that although only Winston Churchill had been with the president before on such an occasion, that was in 1944, but again, that was at a time where at the end of the Second World War, parts of France were then liberated, not least Paris, and it was very significant that Winston Churchill went over to be with the French to remember Armistice, and I think at that time they could see the end of the war, they just knew they didn't know how long it would take in order to defeat Nazi Germany.
Was it dangerous for Churchill to go to Paris for that? Or peace was established in
Well,
Paris?
Churchill had demonstrated a great desire for danger, I mean, throughout his life, but particularly during the Second World War, because he was regularly going to the conferences that he needed to be at with Roosevelt and Stalin, or with Roosevelt himself. And so for that, bearing in mind that the aircraft and ships they used were incredibly vulnerable then. And so, yes, I think he showed an element of courage, but at the same time, that part of France was then liberated, and Germany knew that everyone knew that Germany was going to be defeated. It was just going to be a matter of time.
Let's just pause and reflect on the events of yesterday, where, of course, the Prime Minister was in London alongside all of the other living Prime Ministers, but also the King and the Princess of Wales, who, I mean, when you consider the public events that the King does have to take part in, Remembrance Sunday tops his list, does it, of wanting to be fit and healthy for?
I think for the King it's not a constitutional requirement, but it is a national requirement. And he is the fourth generation of sovereign to take it very seriously. And I think for the King, it is one of those things that he would not wish to miss. Now, he's gone through a great deal, as so many people with cancer have done. And so I think that it's good to see him back doing his duties there in the way that he was, and to have his daughter-in-law, the Princess of Wales, present too. But I think as far as the royal family are concerned, their role is merely to lead the rest of the nation. The idea of armistice, the idea of having 2 minutes silence, it came from the people. It was a response of the world to the moment of peace in 1918. And I think, in a sense, George V, when he started his involvement with it, was at first persuaded to do so, and then realised the power of this very human moment of just stopping for 2 minutes. And families all over the world were doing it. And it had started in South Africa as a regular event, and it was adopted and really took off with public support. It is an event, I think, Remembrance, that operates well because collectively the nation seems to mostly want to get involved.
Well, Alistair, as ever, fascinating and important insight. We appreciate it and delighted to say that Alistair back with us again in about 15, 20 minutes as we do continue to build up to that 2-minute silence at 11 a.m. This Armistice Day. So to come here on The Breakfast Show, how will a second Trump presidency impact US relations with Russia and the war in Ukraine? We'll speak to a Russian security expert next. Welcome back to The Breakfast Show. Well, coming up, how will the West respond to Russia's latest attack on Ukraine? We'll speak to RUSI's Mark Galliotti. That's up next. But first, a reminder of all the day's top stories. Leah's got that for us.
Thank you very much, Wilfred. We'll head over to Ukraine. We're hearing at least 6 people have reportedly been killed in overnight strikes by Russia. Ukraine's Air Force says it shot down several other missiles and drones overnight. The United Nations meeting on climate change, known as COP29, begins in Baku today. The summit has been largely overshadowed by the re-election of Donald Trump, who calls oil liquid gold. And the Israeli government has told its citizens not to attend cultural or sporting events abroad over the next week, including here in the UK. This is following recent violence in Amsterdam.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Donald Trump's re-election has sparked many questions into how the change in American politics could impact the war in Ukraine. After, of course, he claimed he could end the war almost immediately. The president-elect has reportedly held a phone call with Vladimir Putin, during which he urged the Russian president not to escalate the war in Ukraine, although, as our Ivor Bennett reported earlier this hour, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, suggested that phone call had not taken place. Joining us now is the Senior Associate Fellow at RUSI, Mark Galliotti. A very good morning to you, Mark. Thanks so much for joining us. First question actually relates to what the Defence Secretary told me this morning, John Healey, which is that Ukraine's safety is not diminished post the result of the US election. Do you agree?
Well, I think there's a degree of political sugarcoating there. The thing is that we don't really know what Trump actually intends. Yes, he's made various claims about the fact that he would end the war and so forth. But just as Trump has always demonstrated himself to be unpredictable, there are risks for both Russia and Ukraine in this. So although on balance, this means that it's a much more uncertain time for Ukraine, because at present it looks like he really wants to just try and fix the war with the existing front lines. Nonetheless, there's still 2 months for them to convince him otherwise.
In terms of the appointments that he makes, how closely are you watching those as to what he plans for both Ukraine but also Russia specifically? Over the weekend, of course, he ruled out reappointing Mike Pompeo, who was a former Secretary of State and someone who was quite pro-Ukraine.
Yes, and it does seem to be that he's getting pressure from within his own team, including his vice president, who is quite famously hostile to the idea of continuing a sort of open-ended spending of billions of dollars in supporting Ukraine. Anyway, that Trump is getting pressure to precisely appoint someone who could be regarded as, I wouldn't say pro-Russian, but certainly less keen on continuing the war in Ukraine. And this will be really important because we do know, if nothing else, that Trump is not a details man. To a large degree, he will depend on his team to kind of paint a picture of what's going on and also to actually handle all the various nuts and bolts. So I think this will be a pretty important decision.
There's obviously a lot of talk of a potential peace deal if things go certain ways. And usually the purists in Europe who are pro-Ukraine think that that sounds like a terrible deal. Is there a deal that's plausible that isn't so terrible or not?
Look, if we're talking about a deal that is imposed or at least, shall I say, facilitated, within a matter of months, it almost certainly would have to be an ugly peace deal in which essentially Ukraine is trading land for peace. But more to the point, this could well just simply end up being a temporary ceasefire. The question is, what would stop Putin regrouping his forces and coming back for another round when he thinks that the time is right? So I think the key thing is, look, Trump can impose a certain kind of ceasefire if need be by threatening Kyiv to suspend assistance and by threatening to Moscow that it would actually increase assistance to the Ukrainians. But that, as I said, would just simply be a temporary thing. A lasting peace that involves security guarantees for Ukraine and so forth, that is a very, very complex program which can't be done quickly, unfortunately.
What's the latest on the ground for both sides in terms of their ability to continue going as they are at the moment?
Well, I mean, for the moment, the Russians are grinding forward. They're taking massive casualties. We heard from Sir Tony Radakin, the Chief of the Defence Staff, that the last month was the most bloody for the Russians in this entire war. Essentially, Putin is willing to burn through his human ammunition in order to try and ensure that by the time Trump gets inaugurated, the front lines are as favourable for him, and he's also trying to push the Ukrainians out of their small salient in the Kursk region. In terms of sustainability, look, I think both sides are able just about to sort of hold on. The Russians can't really continue quite at this rate indefinitely, but on the other hand, they have the economy for at least another year or two at something like this kind of tempo. So it's not as if this is a war which is going to grind to a halt any day soon, unfortunately.
In terms of the UK-US relationship going forward, and there's lots of moving parts there, of course, does the UK offer the US a lot in terms of facilitating its international and defence policy, or is it a very one-way relationship that doesn't give the UK much leverage?
No, actually, I mean, we have to recognise that although the special relationship gets heavily over-touted at times, and it does feel that at the moment it seems to be just the right to be able to provide soldiers for America's wars abroad, In practice, the UK it's certainly America's most important intelligence partner. And that matters. It's not something that is visible, but it's really crucial. We do provide a whole variety of different sort of access points that the Americans don't have. Britain is still capable of being an intervention country. In other words, that we can deploy forces far from our own homeland in a way that most European countries, frankly, aren't. You know, I don't want to overplay it. There is clearly a massive discrepancy between American and British security capabilities. But nonetheless, given that America does need allies, it can't be the sort of the world policeman alone and so forth. Britain still does matter.
Mark Galeotti, thanks so much for joining us. Great to see you as always. Let's get more now on our Armistice Day and the services that are taking place today around Europe and around the UK. Well, let's get to Daniel Henry, who's at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. Daniel, what's going on there today?
Well, there are hundreds of veterans who will be gathering here today to mark Armistice Day here at the National Arboretum, reflecting on the end of hostilities, which is what Armistice Day is there to mark. And so many people who took part in conflicts over the years, who are here to mark the fact that those hostilities have ended and that those people are still here and those memories are still very, very important. And also not just about the end of World War I, but also marking other conflicts too. I've got the head of learning from the National Arboretum with me, Rachel Smith. Rachel, you and your team have been working on this for many months, all through the year, and it's not just about the veterans, is it? It's also about young people who you're sharing these memories with, aren't you?
Yeah, so over the last month we've been working with about 5,000 young people on site through facilitated visits and also in school as well, passing on that baton of remembrance to future generations and ensuring those stories are not lost and making sure that remembrance is really relevant to them today. And
in terms of making it relevant to that new generation, people who, they haven't necessarily experienced war and conflict like these veterans have, how have they engaged with it?
Yeah, so I think we use a mixture of approaches and actually making it relevant to them using poetry, using music, song, and really unpacking those themes, but also making sure that we remember the conflicts of World War I and World War II. And this year we look at our 80th anniversaries, D-Day 80 and Monte Cassino, but then also bringing it up to date with Afghan 10 and actually making sure that we remember there's those more current conflicts and actually that's in their lifetime. So teaching them the act of remembrance and how to remember.
And the veterans themselves, each year, sadly, we lose more of them. The veterans that are here, and what are they saying to you when you spend time with them and about their experiences?
Yeah, it's so wonderful to hear their stories, and actually for me, my role is that storytelling aspect. So it's about gathering those stories and making making those stories safe for the future and keeping those stories alive. So it's really interesting to meet veterans, to understand their experiences, and also meet people that their families, have people that the families are connected to people that have been lost over the years. It's really important to understand that kind of essence of remembrance and that keep that storytelling alive.
And the National Arboretum, this venue designed for remembrance. I mean, it's an incredible space, really. That it's here, and it really, you can really get that sense of how important this is for the nation to remember, because obviously yes, it's based in Staffordshire, but this is a national monument.
It is, and I think we're open 364 days a year, so for us remembrance is every day apart from Christmas Day, and people remember in different ways. And we've got 150 acres to explore, over 400 memorials, 25,000 trees. There's something for everybody here, so people can take their time to remember loved ones in different ways, and it might be connected to the Armed Forces Memorial and with the 16,000 names on there, or it might be connected to a more sort of personal memorial that's linked with them and their family history, or a connection there.
And as we are just over an hour or so away now from the last post. I mean, that's always such a poignant sound that rings through the air, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think it's that one moment where everybody comes together and stops and reflects, and it is that time to really think and remember. And people do that in all different ways, but I think together as a collective, no matter who you are, that's that kind of symbol for you to do that. So it's really important.
Right, well, Rachel Smith, thank you so very much for joining us here on Sky News this morning. As I say, we're expecting obviously the last post to be heard at 11, as it is every year to mark Armistice Day, and no doubt it will be just as poignant this year as it is every year.
Daniel Henry, thanks so much. Still to come here on The Breakfast Show, where we'll be chatting once again to Alistair Bruce as we build up to the events marking Armistice Day.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. Alex Crawford joining us now from Ukraine.
Their personal possessions are all scattered around the place.
Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, try and make sense of the big numbers for us.
Things can change incredibly quickly, and that's what they have done.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news. The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. I'm Martha Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
In politics is at an all-time low. What's going wrong, and can we fix it? It's from Liz. She wants to know, why is there still no sign of the Labour Party electing a woman as leader?
It's sort of embarrassing. It takes a very strong man to be leader, but it takes an even stronger man to support a woman for leader.
If you want to be mean to politicians, crack on. The activists that go out and make elections happen, I kind of feel just don't be horrible to them. Be polite to them in the same way that they're polite to you.
Keir Starmer has got us into government with a big majority. He was completely clear before the election that he wasn't going to be able to do the two-child benefit policy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't an early thing that comes along.
I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello. No, yes, what is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking land. Let me see it. This is brilliant.
I'm Katie Spencer, and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world, the likes of Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Sir Elton John. We try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back this Armistice Day. We're watching here live pictures in Paris on the Champs-Elysees, and with me here on set is Alistair Bruce. And Alistair, of course, the Prime Minister is there in Paris today for these commemorations.
Yes, and that's significant because as head of government, he's with the French President, head of government, obviously, of France, a great and ancient ally. We're marking 120 years of the Entente Cordiale, which basically was signed in 1904 between France and the then British Empire, which ensured that Britain had its chief ally through both the First and Second World Wars. And it is also very significant that when the armistice was signed, on behalf of the Allies, it was signed by the French and British representatives with the German. So in a sense, there's a great logic to it. But it's also fascinating that the only time this has happened recently was in 1944, when Winston Churchill went over and joined the French president just after the liberation of Paris.
And talk to us about what we can expect here today in London.
Well, the Western Front Association, who keep alive the concept of the unbelievable horrors of the trench warfare of the First World War, will be holding their annual ceremony at the Cenotaph, where we saw the King and the royal family and political leaders, Commonwealth leaders, yesterday. And so that will take place at our 11 o'clock. But of course, for the French, 11 o'clock is our 10 o'clock. And therefore, an hour earlier, their event will take place. But also in the United Kingdom at Alroas, which is where the National Memorial Arboretum is, the Duchess of Edinburgh, on behalf of the King, will attend the 2-minute silence at 11 o'clock there as well.
Raises the question as to whose 11 o'clock the original peace deal was signed at, and whether we should have all adapt accordingly. But each to their own as we go through these events. And talk to me, Alistair, about your perspective on yesterday and the gathering that we saw, because it is something that is very close to the King's heart.
Definitely. I think for the royal family, who responded to this national desire to memorialise the incredible bill of death from the First World War, King George V played his part at the earliest commemorations at the Cenotaph. Initially, the Cenotaph was built out of just basically plaster, but everyone responded to it so warmly that it was therefore replaced by one in Portland stone that we know today. And people saw that empty tomb that is supposed to be represented, cenotaph at the top, as a place to put all their own memories and the dead that they could never make a pilgrimage to see. So many had died at sea or in places that were unreachable in those days. And kings and queens have since always attended. And the King, despite the fact he's had a tough year, was definitely going to make sure he led the nation yesterday.
And he and the Princess of Wales appear, at least, to be in very positive spirits.
Yes, I have no doubt that they are dealing in their own way. As so many cancer patients and sufferers will know, it's a very private process. And anybody who has to deal with that awful disease, it's a, you know, as we look at armistices and wars, it's a war of their own. And I think that, you know, it's good to see them back, and undoubtedly that must represent that, you know, they're both of them dealing with their own situations in a constructive and helpful way for their health.
Alistair, we thank you as always for your insight, and delighted that you'll be with us here on Sky News for the next couple of hours as we do build up to that 11 a.m. UK time moment of silence and remembrance this Armistice Day. Alistair, thank you. We are going to switch focus now and go to the US. And since his White House win last week, Donald Trump, the president-elect, has been busy preparing for his new administration. He'll head to Washington in the coming days to meet President Biden. David Blevins has this report for us from Trump's current residence, Mar-a-Lago.
I'm so happy that that man is going to change things.
It's so exciting. I'm proud to be an American.
All eyes are on Mar-a-Lago, the spiritual home of the president-in-waiting, his followers congregating on a Sunday morning.
Why am I here? We're here every Sunday. This is a church in Mar-a-Lago.
You worship Donald Trump?
No, we don't worship Donald Trump. Let's get that straight. He's God's God. We don't worship Donald Trump, but yes, we support our president.
We're a long way from Washington, but this is where the power rests right now. It's the conversations taking place over there at Mar-a-Lago that will shape America for the next 4 years. We know more about who's out than who's in. Donald Trump posting on his own social media platform that he wouldn't be inviting former Ambassador Nikki Haley or former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to join the administration. He's kept a low profile since his victory speech, with the Democrats in meltdown. The fallout from their defeat is filling the airwaves instead.
If you're an average working person out there, do you really think that the Democratic Party is going to the mats, taking on powerful special interests and fighting for you? I think the overwhelming answer is no, and that is what has got to change.
He'll be hitting the road to Washington this week for an Oval Office meeting with President Biden, the start of the official transition.
President Biden is committed to the peaceful transfer of power and to a responsible handoff from one president to the next. And then they will go through the top issues, both domestic and foreign policy issues, including what is happening in Europe and Asia and the Middle East.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he's spoken to the president-elect 3 times. There's a lot in the in-tray, both at home and abroad. And with Arizona in his grasp, the swing states have rolled over one by one. The road to the White House, now paved in a deep shade of red. David Blevins, Sky News at Mar-a-Lago in Florida.
Let's have a look at the weather here before we leave you. And after days of, fairly relentless, damp and gloomy weather, today brings a very welcome change. Blue skies and sunshine, but clear skies overnight means it will be chilly, with a touch of frost in the north and some fog patches. Cloud and patchy rain will linger over southern England. The cloudy and damp conditions in the far south will clear through the morning to have a mostly dry day with light winds and plenty of sunshine. Temperatures will be around average, but that will feel pleasant enough under sunny skies. North Sea coasts will be breezier with the odd shower clipping in from the far north of Scotland and eastern England. We're in for a chilly night with a touch of frost. Fog will readily reform across parts of northern Britain and Northern Ireland, and the wind will pick up in the southeast of England after a few showers. That's your weather. Well, after this short break, we will be building up to the Armistice services and remembrance moments, including the moment of silence in an hour's time with our events commentator, Alistair Bruce.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Good morning, this is Sky News. It is 10 o'clock and it is Armistice Day, with commemorations taking place across the UK and also across Europe. I'm joined now by our commentator, Alistair Bruce. Alistair.
It is, of course, approaching 11 o'clock in Europe, and for France, where the armistice was signed all those years ago, it is natural that around locations, particularly in Belgium, in Ypres, that the Menin Gate, a gate that saw so much of the battle and for whom so many of those who served on the Western Front had to march through this gate, and therefore it means a great deal. And representatives obviously echoing the Ukrainian situation now at Ypres. Meanwhile, in Paris, they're gathering at the Arc de Triomphe, where the memorial for the First World War, the unknown warrior, is placed, and others all gathered there. So in Ypres, a place where every night they sound the silence for those who were killed. It is one of the most remarkable memorials. It's covered in names. It was rebuilt after the whole of Ypres had itself been completely decimated by the warfare that took place. And it was where, always, it was decided people would remember and recall the past. And instructions being given as to what will take place later on. And meanwhile, in Paris, where it's pouring with rain, waiting for the President with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to meet together and play their part in this act of remembrance. Why does armistice mean anything to us today? It was such a conflagration, the First World War, the first time the whole world, with all the mechanical efficiency of death that had been created, came into a world war. And its ending achieved an enormous moment and sense of relief for families who had lost people they loved, and for all of those who would then need to rebuild the peace afterwards. Senior officers have been arriving here. It's very much a reflection of the NATO of today in Paris, and they have all sent their representatives in order to play their part in reflecting upon armistice as the magic of what it represents. Meanwhile, in Ypres, the trumpeters are lined up. They give their bugle call every night to mark a moment of remembrance, and further instructions being given and talks being made by those who've come to the Menin Gate, which itself is in a state of repair, and it is maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And we can see on the right-hand side of the picture the flag of Belgium, of the United Kingdom, and of other nations and organisations who are responsible for maintaining this important role.
His words feel more urgent today than ever, as we witness ongoing conflicts around the globe, with some leaders even hinting at the use of weapons of mass destruction. Many believe that we are closer to a third world war than at any time during the past 75 years. Faced with this terrifying prospect, what conclusions can we draw about our presence here today? The first lesson is that war, any war, brings terrible loss and suffering. Consequently, it teaches us that everything possible must be done to avoid it. At the same time, however, we must remember that peace is more than just the absence of war. Peace must allow us to live our lives the way we wish, in freedom and security. There is no reason why peace, freedom and security should not be compatible. But there are times in history when they were not. Einstein knew that the world is a dangerous place, not only because of those who do evil, but also because of those who look on and do nothing. This was the dilemma facing the men whose names lined these walls back in 1914. Should they fight to maintain values and a way of life in which there was a place for everyone? Or should they accept a false peace dominated by dictatorship and violence? They chose to fight. Today, we all still benefit from their terrible sacrifice, which is why we remember them with such gratitude. And what of the future? What if our values and freedoms are threatened and confront us with the same hard choices of our forefathers?